much is made of the great houses of software coming out of Japan, the United States, even countries like England. But down under, there was software as well. And we have with us today a man who has left his mark. Many, many games that people would have never known were coming from Australia. Well, they did, and they were some very impressive titles that led to interesting takes and adaptations of existing properties. And, well, we're here to hear those stories from Mr. Gregg Barnett. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Carl.
Okay. Now, Gregg, always like to start from the beginning. So tell us a little bit about your educational background.
I think basically it's going back a long time. I fully intended the late 1970s, when we're talking about, was the era when the Australian film industry kicked off big time with all sorts of films and all sorts of actors which are world names now, from Mel Gibson to Judy Davis to whatever. Everything was happening in those days and all sorts of stuff was happening. So initially I wrote to the Australian Film and Television School and inquired about how I could become a student there. And they said, you need to go out and get some world experience. We don't take people straight from school. So I then went to Melbourne University to do computer science, and I sort of ended up combining my two likes of the sort of the film industry in those days and creating something like a film where I combined that with the excitement of the home computer industry, which was also just starting off in the late 70s and stuff like that. The high schools had their first computers and games on the early consoles like Atari 2600 were coming out. So I think it was in my third year doing computer science at Melbourne Uni, I saw a job advert by an Australian games studio, which there was only one. I didn't even know at the time there was one, which was in Melbourne, which was not far from where I lived in Melbourne, actually. So I went and did an interview and showed them stuff I was working on, and they offered me a job. They already had 3 programmers and I believe an artist at the time. So I became their 4th programmer, and so I left Melbourne Uni to join Beam Software, which was in its early days, but even then it had already owned Melbourne House, which was obviously named after Melbourne, where it wasn't, but it was one of the big 3 publishers in the United Kingdom. You mentioned England in your intro. We obviously were quite big in England at the time. I started with Beam Software, and that was it.
Yeah. If I can interrupt for just a moment, going back, so you wanted to get into film. What was your interest in the film industry? Was it screenwriting, directing? What was your goal at that time?
My interest in the film industry would have been screenwriting and directing, actually, which is more or less where I ended up in the game industry after a long time, I suppose, after doing quite a bit of programming. I'm basically a game director and game designer. That was my interest in those days, was the early film industry down here. Obviously, there's been a film industry going around for some time everywhere, including down here, but this is when it was huge down here. It was taking off big time. So I was quite interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, Mad Max.
It was in that era of Mad Max. Yes, exactly.
So you get into programming now. When you approach Beam Software, what kind of machine are you working on? Do you have a machine at home? Are you just doing stuff on university mainframes? What is the software that you're showing them?
In terms of the game software, I had an Atari 400, which had only been out for a couple of months. I programmed a driving game like, say, the early Pole Position, which was an arcade game at the time. I did a small version of it on the Atari 400 to sort of take to the interview and get the job. And what I did after joining Beam was become their 6502 program, which was the processor in the Ataris and the Commodores at the time. Everybody else there worked on Z80s, which was the processor in Coleco, which was a console, and the Sinclair machines in England. So I became the 652 program, but actually my first job was doing some type-in basic games for books for the Commodore and the VIC-20. The Commodore 64 had only been released at that time, and so I did 8 type-in basic books for that, and they also helped, I think, on how to program in basic book. I don't know how much I contributed to that, can't really remember because I wasn't the main person on it, I don't think, but it was mainly taking these basic games and putting them into a book, which is only a small job, but it was a starting point.
Now, so you're doing this before you're at Beam, or was this something that Beam
No, it was at Beam. It was my first job at Beam was the Commodore 64 and VIC-20 game books, which I said were type-in basic books. It always amazed me in those days that kids and people were happy to buy books and type in games, and they didn't actually make mistakes. Like you could ask somebody these days to type, somebody who isn't a programmer to type in computer code, and there's so many mistakes. But in those days, people who didn't know anything about it just typed it in and it worked, which is incredible. I always found that incredible at the time. If you want to go into the next phase at Beam Software, basically the first games that Beam had done by themselves were games based on a character called Horace, which was 3 games. Hungry Horace, which was almost a Pac-Man clone to a certain extent. Horace Goes Skiing, and Horace and the Spiders. So I ported those games to the Commodore 64, and I also ported The Hobbit to the Commodore 64, and then I actually asked to do an original game, and I came up with Way of the Exploding Fist as my first original game.
Now, and I think here we need to set the stage because, I mean, the listeners from the United States and even European listeners may not really understand what is the scene in Australia and what is that relationship to the UK. Because like you said, Melbourne House is one of the big 3 publishers, very big in the UK. Your Horace is still thought of today as mainly a ZX Spectrum character by many people. So what is, when you guys are making games, are you thinking primarily, what is your primary market for them?
When Beam started, they sort of aligned accidentally but quite closely to the Sinclair machines as they come out in England. But they had also been working on the American TRS-80, and they were looking at the consoles, in particular the Z80 consoles like the Coleco. Obviously, I come on board and I knew all about the Atari stuff. And I don't think we did any programming for the Atari 2600, but we looked at the other Atari consoles. But we mainly, because, as I said, the core of the company at that time was Z80 programmers, so the focus was on Z80-based machines. But that sort of changed in terms of the home computer market, because obviously Apple was there, but it wasn't really a game machine. And we were starting to look at the home computer market, and they started with books because hence the name. Melbourne House was actually a book publisher before it was a game publisher. So it was known down here as a book publisher of alternative books, female liberation and all that sort of thing in the time. And then it branched into games, and then games became everything for the company. So the focus had been early on, it had been books. Then it became games for the Sinclair machines. But because they had been a book publisher, they forged a relationship with the Tolkien estate and bought The Hobbit, which was a natural fit. So they did a point-and-click adventure game based on The Hobbit, which was huge. It became a huge thing. And at that point, the 6502 machines, apart from the Spectrum in the UK, were the game machines. And obviously it got emphasised more after the Nintendo NES came out, which was 6502 as well. So it was all happening on my side of the company at that point. And games like Way of the Exploding Fist and Rock and Wrestle and things, they started on the Commodore 64 and then were ported over to the Sinclair Spectrum or any other machine. Like in those days, it was the Amstrad. Even the BBC Micro came in for a while, but it was a 6502 machine as well. and even a weird machine called the Auric, which didn't have legs. We did a couple of things for it. It was a really weird machine to program for in lots of ways, which I could explain if people were interested.
Okay, definitely.
But it was, yeah, so they were the key machines at the time. The Spectrum was about half our work, and the Commodore 64 was the other half.
Gotcha. Now, at this point in time, you're mainly still working as a programmer. You're not doing any of the big decisions as far as management is concerned, I'm guessing, correct?
Cool. Yeah, it's because you're going back so early in the game industry. You say you're only working as a programmer. I can let everybody into a secret. In those days, the only people in the game industry were programmers. There were no designers. There were no artists. They were programmers. I did the art, and by art I mean I'm not an artist, but you would just draw things. You would fill in dots on graph paper and convert those dots into binary numbers or hexadecimal numbers, and you would program those in, and that would become your art. And I can actually remember it was about, I don't know when exactly in year terms, but it was probably 84 or something. I was at a meeting of the whole of at the main Beam dev meeting at the time, and I sat back and I said, look guys, I've got an idea. Why don't we hire an artist? And everybody looked at me like I was stupid. So we advertised for artists, and the first people who came in had portfolios from advertising companies, and they weren't the sort of artists we were looking for, obviously. I mean, they weren't pixel artists, and we ended up with graduates out of art school who thought, great, there actually is a way you can do pixel art and get paid for it. So that's how it started off for us anyway down there. It was just saying, well, I'm sick of doing art with graph paper. Can we hire somebody?
And speaking of art, so you do the port of The Hobbit to the Commodore 64, at least the first port.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what is that process like this early in the game? We're talking 1983, I believe, or 82, 83. I mean, obviously, you described it. You just said, there was the ZX Spectrum side of the company and there was your side of the company. When you get the call to make this conversion, what do you get from the ZX Spectrum side? What can you use? Can you use because it's using on the line drawings for the artwork, can you use that data? Can you import it? Do you have to re-input it? What's that process look like at this point?
For the Hobbit, it was actually reasonably easy. Yes, the initial Hobbit was, as you said, it was line art with colour fills. An artist again weren't involved in that particular thing, and each of the Hobbit screens was under 128 bytes, and it basically consisted of data like put cursor here, draw a line to there, draw a line there, then fill this in green, and you had the Hobbit's door of his house, for argument's sake. So the actual data for the graphics didn't need to change. The data for the main game puzzles didn't need to change. It was all well done on this Spectrum side. It was a good engine and a good parser. All I had to do was handle all the I/O routines, which were hardware specific. I had to take all that data and then do the routines that would draw those lines and do those fills on the Commodore chips, as opposed to the Spectrum, which was only, and had to be said in those days, the Spectrum was obviously only basically a bitmap display, whereas the Commodore obviously had sprites and other things. So we weren't really using those to any great effect in the Hobbit, but the way it did, its art was a more advanced way than the Spectrum, which was always just purely a bitmap screen which you throw stuff at, but had a bit of processing clout with its processor. So it was quite a simple matter to just take that data and do the port. Actually, it didn't take all that long. I think it took about 6 to 8 weeks for the Commodore 64 port of that particular thing. It was one of the easier ports we had. And then obviously after it was a huge success, we then did a version with art-based bitmapped screens and everything, and it was first done on the Commodore 64, and then that was ported the other way. But I think at the same time, the original Hobbit team were working on Sherlock Holmes and stuff, and Lord of the Rings possibly as well, on the Spectrum machines. So there were ports going either which way.
Gotcha. And so then we get to your first original game there, which is The Way of the Exploding Fist. Now, how does this come about at this point? Do you have to get permission from management to start development of a game? Do you just start working on your own and then you're like, hey, we've got something? How does that come about back then?
Well, yes, all of the above to a certain extent. Yes, I had to ask, obviously. In those days, there was only one person in charge. That was Alfred Milgram. He was the manager at BMD, the company. But the point was, after working there for, I don't know, I can't tell you how many years, it was every year and a half, 2 years or whatever, and all these other things. I mean, there wasn't any issue about saying, well, now's the time we do something original. And after everybody, well, after he saw and people saw what I was proposing, because there hadn't been any beat-em-up games on home computers at the time. I think the closest while we were working on it was the first version of maybe the Karate game, which is a precursor to Prince of Persia on the Apple, but it was basically only two moves. You could kick high or you could kick low, so it was two keys, and it wasn't really a proper beat-em-up, which had started to appear in the arcades, including the odd Karate game in the arcades. While I was working on Exploding Fist, I saw the odd Karate game in the arcades, and even a couple of things we did. To be fair, we did copy a little bit from it. But it basically was an ideal fit for the Commodore 64 because it could use sprites. I could have two characters going, and it also, I suppose, if we get into how I programmed it, in those days, and even now, I suppose, I would design my code out. I suppose I would design it out and then work out the algorithms and take more time on that than I would do on the actual coding. And so that there was, I must admit, there was a small amount of tension happening with the then management in that they weren't seeing anything because of the way I was doing things. I was getting everything ready. I was working out all the algorithms for, basically, I was working out everything for a two-player game without the AI, even though I'd already worked out how I was going to do that because it wasn't all that hard. But the interesting thing was it had been, I don't know, been 6 weeks or something, and they hadn't seen anything. And I had some art done, and they'd seen the art that the artist, one of our new artists, had done, was really nice. So, and then come the time, and I overnight and whatever, I started putting everything together. And I don't know whether it was the first compile, the second compile, the third, but it was certainly almost immediately where this whole thing I didn't have anything. I typed in everything, and I got everything, and then everything worked for a two-player game. And I thought, oh, this is good, and I'll go make a coffee and just relax for a bit. And I come back to I went to the kitchen, made a coffee, and I come back to my computer, and there was a queue of people at my computer wanting to play the game. And it was just the first version of it. And Gregg Milgram at the time, the MD, as I said, he came around and he said, now we know we have a hit. And we knew then because literally everybody was queued up playing the thing. And it was the early days. So it all took off from there, and it was, it all went well from that point on, I suppose. I should, now after talking about how that worked out, it also reminds me of some things I should possibly go back to the previous Hobbit conversation if you want to.
Please, yeah.
Because in talking about, I know it's sort of more the emphasis on management decisions and things, but it's also, I think people find interesting is the difference in development in those days, because everybody's got computers these days. They got high level, they got engines like Unreal or Unity, and they don't get anywhere near the hardware. Whereas obviously in those days we programmed the hardware in machine language. But we also did it in the early days using cassette or tape drives and things. And even, I said I just did the porting routines for the Hobbit. I sort of had a code database almost of the full stuff I was using, some compile. But even that would take 6 hours to compile. You couldn't afford an error because you would be there for 6 hours with the tape deck going through compiling. And and the reason I know some of these times, well, it was actually the year and the time that Australia won the America's Cup, which is a big yacht race for the first time anybody had ever beaten America. And it was obviously happening in America overnight. And I was working back in the office, and I started a build before they started the race. And they finished the race, and they all had their parties, and I'm still sitting there waiting for the thing to complete. And Prime Minister of Australia comes on that next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, I'm still in the office working on this thing. He comes in at the morning all drunk and everything saying, it's a great day and everybody should take the day off, and any boss who sacks an employee today is a bastard and all this sort of stuff. And I'm sitting there all night working on this thing, and I'm not working on it because it takes forever to compile. And it was just a time. People don't get over how, can't understand how long things took in those days. You couldn't afford mistakes.
As somebody, I was one of those kids that you mentioned earlier who was typing in listings from books. So I totally understand that. So you're actually compiling it from cassette. I mean, not even doing it to disk at that point, or
no. The first Hobbit was actually assembled in machine language. There wasn't any such thing as a compiler sort of those days, or anything that links code. It was actually assembled. But it wasn't as I said, it wasn't as, when I say assembled, that's just parsing it and turning it into machine code. So the Hobbit it was typed in assembly language. It wasn't typed in any high level language like BASIC or anything. It was purely, if you wanted to load something in the register, load A60 or something, which would turn that into A9, 60 or whatever. And that's how you program things. And you quite often programmed into memory to correct. You didn't have any, you were programming the computer. If you wanted to manipulate the video chip, you programmed into the video chip or put data into it direct. You didn't do anything, intermediate. So that was assembled, but it did, it was a slight, the first one, when we did everything, it was about 6 hours. The America's Cup one for the final one is about 4.5 hours. That's what it sort of come down to in the end. But that wasn't a whole program. If it had been the whole Hobbit, you would have been there for a whole day, basically.
Geez.
So that was in the early days, and that was, using machine learning. But it was a good foundation to programming, to be honest. And also it was exciting because I'm sure we'll talk more about when Nintendo comes up or something, but even with like the Atari and even with the Commodore 64, like it being part of the process is like when a computer comes out, and more so when a console comes out, there isn't any manual for the developers, because obviously Atari in those days did their own stuff. Nintendo certainly did their own stuff initially. Everybody, and even the so-called friendly computer makers like Sinclair and Commodore, they didn't have manuals. We wrote the manuals. We wrote the books. That's what Bean did. Melbourne House published the books. But when something like, say, a Commodore 64 comes out, somebody like me would have to sort of start poking values everywhere in memory I could access, and suddenly I'd find, something's changed on the screen. So I'm in the range of the video chip now. So what does this do? Well, something just popped on a sprite. What happens if I do that? It moves. That's how you figured it out. There was no manuals. Texas Instruments, for instance, the machines with Belgium, they hit all their, all their video chips worked. There wasn't. So, and that sort of the jump forward a smidge and went to the nth degree when I always reverse engineered on software side, but we also had people who could reverse engineer on the hardware side. And when Nintendo came out, the NES, the first Nintendo, we not just reverse engineered software, reverse engineered the hardware, and we basically created the initial dev manuals and dev systems, which we could sell to other people, even like Konami and people. We could sell kits to them, which let them program the Nintendo. And then that's somebody who at the time was, or became soon after, Nintendo's closest ally, basically. But even in those days, it was people didn't have the means of doing some of these things.
Now, and this is an interesting question because obviously you're dealing with a lot of time investment for experimentation, a lot of time investment for cataloging all this stuff that isn't directly leading to a sellable product. Because after you've figured all that out, now you still have to make the new games. Are you a full-time employee? Are you getting paid hourly? Is it a contract basis? How is that working out? Because, there's so much time in it.
Yeah, well, in those days, everybody who worked at the Melbourne House was a full-time employee paid on a wage. So on the plus side, it means that you were just on a consistent income. On the downside, we didn't really take advantage of the royalty situations which some other game studios had going. So, the plus side, you had a permanent job, and through thick or thin. On the downside, if your game did incredibly well, like Exploding Fist or something, sure, you might get the odd bonus and things, but you weren't on a share of the profit or anything like that.
Gotcha. Now, so you guys are making these games. You've created this first version of Fist. I do have to ask a quick question because we already mentioned it with the Hobbit. There's a disc version later on that's using more detailed artwork on the C64.
And music.
When you're making these games and making design decisions, is the format that the game has to work on, cassette versus disc and so forth, is that already an issue? Is that being baked into the design?
It's an interesting question, but it's sort of, I suppose, technically, in a weird way, it's more the sort of question that applies these days or whatever. It's not in those days when you're doing games and you're on the coalface, and by being on the coalface, I mean you're programming the video chips, the hardware, and whatever. You're always at the max, so everything you do, it automatically fits into the maximum you can do. It's just how skilled you are at doing that, and for some reason we never really thought of things that were beyond the scope of what we do. We thought we were having, really high-end ideas and whatever, but they were always in the context of what we could do. That didn't become part of any decision-making process to a certain extent because we were so, I suppose it's hard for people to understand these days, because in those days, as I keep saying, we were so married to the hardware. Like I knew the Commodore 64 or the Atari machines or whatever inside out. So I wouldn't even think of it proposing something that wouldn't automatically work. It didn't even become part of the thought process. And the problem, and the machines, the end result, they were pretty even and parallel. And when I say that, I mean between the ZX-based machines or the 8080-based machines, even the 16-bit ones when they come, and likewise on the 6502. It was just that the way you achieved that parity was totally different. The 6502 machines invariably use sprites and tricks on the hardware, and how good you were depended on how you could use those tricks. Like all the game magazines in those days, when you interview programmers, they're all trying to do the fastest, smoothest scroll. Horizontal scrolls were easy to a certain extent. Vertical scrolls could be tricky with the hardware, whereas on the pixel-based machines, like the Spectrums and whatever, it was the other way around, and to a certain extent. But the Spectrum and those sort of machines, people had much more effort learning tricks about just how they could throw graphics at a screen, whereas the 6502 machines, you were learning all the tricks about how you could manipulate sprites and even manipulate the electron beams that come down the screen to do certain effects. And like I was always counting machine cycles when the beam went off screen to when it came on. I'd try to do some sneaky things like change sprite parameters and whatever. So you get more, I think it's not a well-known game, but probably the last sort of game I sort of more designed it than programmed. It was all about I don't know what that term is for when you're just trying to do something to sort of see if you can do it, or even show off a little bit. I created a game called Bedlam, which had more sprites on screen at once. I think it had 40 sprites, but Commodore only has 8 sprites. But the way slicing around and doing stuff, and you just kept reusing and tricking the hardware. So whereas other programmers achieved some incredible scrolling techniques in those days. That was just, to answer your original question, those decisions weren't needed so much because you were married to the hardware, you knew what it could do, and even the other machines could do the same, but in a different way.
Gotcha. And that was going to be my next question. I mean, did you ever limit what you did on one machine because you were afraid it wasn't going to be portable to the other systems?
Not in those days. Things we knew things would look like the Spectrum didn't have the colours of the, if you do it, you're always quite often on the ZX machines you were doing, on the 8080 machines you were doing stuff in 16 colours for argument's sake, and even then you might be, the way you can change those colours, you were more restricted. Like the sprite-based machines, you could change colours on a pixel basis. Quite often on some of the other machines you could only change them on a character basis. Like the original Hobbit, some of the stuff was character colour changes and stuff. and the Oric, as I said, as I mentioned quite early, which I can't remember too much on, but I do remember the weird thing about it was you could either you could use the CPU or you could use the video chip. And if you wanted to change when you wanted to change something on the screen, if you did it while the screen was on, that screen would go black in those areas. So you'd have characters of black lines on the screen when you were doing code. It was very hard to avoid that. And it was just a weird technique, sharing a bus basically between two chips. So that one I remembered as being quite weird. I don't think it lasted very long, but it was just a strange machine. It had some power in other areas. All these machines in those days, some of them had power in certain areas, but it was very hard to do a complete console in particular, unless you had a lot of money or a complete home computer.
Gotcha. Now, obviously these are very much machines that European listeners will be familiar with. Even the Oric, is something that most European retro gamers nowadays are familiar with as far as the name. Did all of these machines have penetration in Australia as well at that time, or how did that work?
No, the thing about it was interesting premise in your question at the start about, there's okay. Japan, there's Australia, there's Britain, there's Europe, there's the United States. You did mention there's the United States, and there's Australia. But the thing is, in Australia, you tend, more so than anywhere, you tend to look what everybody else is doing. Like in Japan, quite often they focus heavily on what they were doing or what their consumers wanted and what their market is. And that was even more so in the United States in those days and for a long period. The UK had a self-sustaining game market because people were buying into it big time. But even though they did look a little bit to Europe, but it was hard for Europeans. They would have to be, because most people were doing the original games in English or whatever, or Japanese, I suppose. And so the European markets tend to latch onto certain games and things, and then become quite. You'd suddenly find that you had a huge fan base for one particular game in say France or Holland or Germany or wherever. Discworld in Germany, for argument's sake, but also Eastern Europe in those days. There was a massive appetite you would find, and for people in Europe in particular. And I've had, it's not just it's everywhere. Like I've had people in Africa who I've met just somewhere else, and they've said their first experience of games was Exploding Fist on the Commodore 64. The era of Commodore 64 and the era of Exploding Fist in that time, it's probably the most mentioned thing to me about anything I've ever done, because it was when it sort of synced up with when a lot of people who started playing games and then ended up in games and whatever. I think the classic story for me actually was I was at a game show somewhere and I got a call from one of the head guys at Rovio, the Angry Birds studio. Yeah. And said, can you come for a meet? And I thought, well, maybe I want to talk about a game. And, that's great. It'd be great to do a game with those guys. And I get there, and he said, we're not going to talk about game, but I just wanted to, the guy said, I just wanted to thank you because I was brought up in Zimbabwe, and the first game I saw was the Commodore 64 and Exploding Fist, and you basically set me on my path to games and to this company. And I've had that, in all honesty, I've had that half a dozen times in my career. I've had people say something similar to that in weird ways. So that's always meaningful, but it was good to be in that era when, things were starting off. And obviously Exploding Fist, whatever it is, a retro game. They even opened up a few years ago. They flew me up to Sydney from Melbourne. They opened up a retro cafe, which was based around Exploding Fist.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
So there's it's an era, and I mean, in all honesty, I look on that side of it with excitement. But when people create retro games today from scratch, like with pixel art, I'm not a great fan because, the thing is, I'm happy from a creative exercise to what they've done, and I really appreciate whatever they're creating. But it's a hard thing to explain. But in those days, how you see, or how somebody young in particular, maybe not yourself, but somebody like a kid today sees TV or whatever, to them it's pretty realistic. It's their realism. In those days, the 160 or the 200 by 160 screen looked real to us. People in those days, it looked real. So
Yeah.
but now when you see when you see somebody do pixel art, it looks pixelated, obviously, and it just sort of it doesn't quite gel so much, whereas it does for people who haven't seen it in the past.
No, I understand. I mean, as somebody who grew up, got my Commodore 64 in 1985, and yes, Way of the Exploding Fist was one of those games that I played incessantly. I totally understand it. I mean, it did look realistic, and yeah, that's what you were going for at the time, and to go back to pixelation without that expectation of realism is, yeah, I can imagine it's jarring.
You hit the nail on the head quite well there. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays it's an art style. Back then it was, this is as cool as it's going to get with the given technology. And so, yeah, the motivations for creating that art are two very different motivations back then and today. But okay, so you create Way of the Exploding Fist. You followed up with Fist 2, which I've actually just had this conversation with somebody the other day. I equated it to the difference between Alien and Aliens, where the first movie is a horror movie. The second one takes it and turns into an action movie with more of a plot. And here you had the one-on-one fighting game, and now it becomes a journey. How was that process done, and how much bigger was the investment in time and resources to make the game as opposed to the original?
Pro rata, it was probably okay time and resources, because we obviously had the engine, which, for want of a better term, Exploding Fist. It was basically, it's interesting, I don't know, so sometime back, maybe earlier in the year, somebody, I was going to say somebody else. No, I think I took an interview on Discworld from Germany on this. Somewhere else, somebody interviewed me on Way of the Exploding Fist 2. And it was quite a sort of an honest interview from, I think it might have been from Germany too, because it was a very honest interview from they're saying, this was clearly ambitious, but it didn't quite work. And they're right. And that's how basically, from my perspective, I was, this might not make sort of some sense, but one of my favourite game series when I was even before, when I was just starting games, was the Ultima games, which are RPGs. And I always like big worlds to explore and stuff like that. So I wanted to sort of combine a bigger world with combat at certain points, which is sort of, it is how a lot of games are these days. I mean, but they're obviously much better and seamless. But, these days, whether it's Far Cry or whatever, it's a big world where you have combat at certain points. Obviously, in those days, it was more, fixed in that you could find your way to a point, get through a couple of puzzles, maybe knock down a tree or thing, and then you'd have to have a fight, and they would get harder and harder. So that was the style, to make an open game with a story, an overarching story, and but it still was an excuse for fighting at certain points. It didn't quite gel, but it didn't look like, even I knew that at the time, at the end, sort of wasn't quite gelling, but at least it was finished and polished. So that's why it was released. And it didn't sort of cost anything exorbitant or anything. Because I said we had the engine to start with, and doing the art wasn't all that hard, and it could be planned out. But it sort of, in hindsight, it probably it was obviously too ambitious to what we should have been doing. It wasn't the natural sequel to Exploding Fist. So we were trying to change genres totally and go to something bigger. But that was all me. I mean, it wasn't anybody else. But by then I could obviously choose more or less what I wanted to do. So that was fine. But yeah, it has the guy who interviewed me recently, or some early in the year, said it was extremely ambitious, but it didn't quite work. That's true.
And since you mentioned Ultima as an inspiration, and it was always something that I thought of as well when I was looking at the game, especially in retrospect, did you ever consider doing a split between one-on-one fighting in the vein of the first game, and then instead of moving the character from left to right or right to left, just going to an overhead map like in an Ultima game? Was that ever a consideration during the design?
No, it could have been, but it wasn't. It was always, as it ended up, was more or less, it was always going to be sort of the 2D, the side view sort of thing. Because wasn't just purely wasn't sort of an open world that I was also getting to. It was more. It was also meant to be the sort of the world as a slice of the world, and you have to move up and down and around and through, but not so much by walking freely around like in a top-down map in Ultima, but by, I can't remember exactly what I was doing in this, but I think you were climbing things and knocking down trees and doing a few other things to get access to the temples or wherever you were going. So no, but I mean, it could have been explored in different ways, but it seemed like a firm idea at the time, I'm sure.
Well, you only know after you've tried it. Now,
to a certain extent, I'm not a great believer in that to a big extent. I'd like to work things out up front, but sometimes I've found that anything I've done that hasn't quite worked, I've known. It's always been based on an assumption. I've known exactly, like Exploding Fist 2, I knew exactly what that 90% point would be, which is basically where it ended up, at the 90% point. But I always assumed by the time that journey was complete, I would know what the other 10% should be, which wasn't the case.
Now, at some point, if I understand your biography correctly, you go from just being somebody who's coding and making games to more of a management role at Melbourne House, correct? Or Beam, sorry, Beam.
Yes, well, quite early on, I was the software development director, I suppose. I think that was the title. But that was relatively early on. And that sort of coincided with moving out of programming, apart from the odd thing on a sort of a casual basis, and more. At that point, everybody realised that design was a thing, and that was my natural thing, and so I always did design, whether it was formally recognised or not. But also directing and producing multiple titles across all platforms and whatever. So, yes, I moved into that. I don't know when, but it'd be the mid-'80s, I suppose. There's Exploding Fist, then Rock and Wrestle, which was the next big one, and as you said, Fist 2. So probably after that, when the NES come out, so it'd be pre-86, about 86 or whatever, maybe.
Yeah, probably around 86. So in that role, or what is your role then? Are you how many projects are you supervising? Are you just the one who okays proposals? What exactly does that role look like early on?
Early on, it was supervising in the sense of what you would call producing, I suppose. Or I'm not a natural producer in some ways, but I've produced everything I've ever made. But quite often with system producers. But I'm more, whatever the term would be, if there actually is a term, game director, but it's used slightly different to what I'm using for. But I'm basically always been the director of a game, like the film director is the director of the film. Basically, organise the team, but also the most important thing for me is the creative vision of the game. I'm always the person who would sort of help set the creative vision and then get the team on board and get their ideas into that vision, and then so it becomes a shared vision. That was my big thing in those things. So yes, it was. If there was projects, say we might have been doing at the same Exploding Fist 2 at the same time as the Hobbit. That would have come after the Hobbit 2, I think, the Hobbit remake. But there would be, say, three projects going on, and I'd be, like Rock and Wrestle and Exploding Fist 2. That's probably a better combination. So I'll be designing and looking after the lead version quite closely, but also staggering a port, like to the Spectrum, to the Amstrad, to wherever else was in the porting sites. So yeah, you'd be handling, say, 3 projects across 3 platforms.
Gotcha. And it's at what point? So you're handling all these different projects. Are you the only person with that kind of role, or are you really supervising all of the projects that are development at Beam, or are there other people running projects in parallel?
I think when I was the software development director, I was probably the only person doing it. There was a sort of, before that, there had been the team and led by Philip Mitchell, who was the lead programmer. Before, he was the Beam's, possibly their first programmer. Who did the Hobbit, the original Hobbit and stuff, and he was working on other games, Lord of the Rings and whatever. And then I think he left for a few years or whatever, might have come back at some point for a while. In the interim period like that, then we might have fragmented off again into, there were people doing a big adventure game or something. And then obviously the console. And then what changed was with Nintendo came all the licensing and all that sort of stuff, where people literally were coming from everywhere wanting you to do anything. Like I can literally remember in Melbourne one week, as people in the early Nintendo days, people coming from California. That we had a group come from California who had the business, which was California Raisins, which made raisins. Used raisins obviously. It was a big. Everyone knew California Raisins, even in Australia, but they wanted to do a game using a raisin as the lead character. Somebody else come down and they had a pizza line. They wanted to do a game. This is from America again, wanted to do some on pizzas. We had people, toy companies coming down saying, we've got comic licenses. Can you do something on these comics? Can you do something on our toys? Well, then film companies coming saying, we can do films. People with rock bands and we were saying, can you do a game on our rock band? I can't emphasize how crazy it was in those early Nintendo games. Suddenly there was some console which was mass market, and suddenly everybody thought, the bandwagon was to just license everything. So we did a few of those things. Some worked, some didn't, but it was just crazy in those days.
Well, and I guess that's an interesting transition because, starting with The Hobbit, there's obviously license-based work happening inside of Beam. The connection with Melbourne House is there. And I would like to ask whether or not you had any involvement with Samurai Warrior, the Usagi Yojimbo game. Was that something you supervised?
No, it's interesting. You actually mentioned that one of the people I work with now, he just gave me a message the other day saying that Doug Palmer sends his regards to some guy he met out of nowhere, and he said he worked with me. He was actually a programmer who joined Beam, and there was a couple, even one to other programs, Steve Taylor, I think maybe, and they sort of were working on stuff, and they were strongly saying, "Oh, we want to do a comic, we want to do this comic-based game." So it sort of come from certain people, I believe, in the programming team, and then we got that license because it turned out it didn't cost very much. I don't think it was at those days. It was, and then did a game on that. Ironically, at the same time, I think LJ and Toys come over from New York, and they had bought quite a few Marvel properties, and they loved the Punisher, so they wanted us to do a game of the Punisher. So we were doing the Punisher and Usagi Yojimbo, which were totally different licenses, obviously, but the thing I have to emphasise, when you mention stuff like The Hobbit or whatever in the early days, they were licenses we went out and got. I didn't actually go out and get that, but we, as in Beam Software, went out and got because we wanted to do games based on them. So it wasn't really a license, whereas these other license deals, Usagi Yojimbo was like that too. It started in the programming team, and then it went to the company, the management, and then they went out and got the license. But most of the other license stuff that comes through was people, publishers, third-party publishers or whatever, who bought licenses and brought it to us. We had no vested interest in the license. We tried to design a game, and it's very hard, obviously, with a lot of film properties and things, to do something to meet the expectations of everybody, and certainly the end player, because everybody knows that film games, they're pretty rare, just like films made about games that have any, hardly any good ones. So, so there was that difference. It's different because The Hobbit was a project which Beam loved, but obviously some of these other things were just done because they were good financial deals.
And I obviously we can't talk about numbers or anything specific, but I'm trying to really wrap my head around the financial side, the business side of this. So let's say somebody's coming to you because they've got fast food mascot X. Let's not use any particular example, but are they hiring Beam Software as a development studio so they can then go to Nintendo and have the game published? Are they coming to you and saying, hey, we've got this, it's going to be really cool, we'll give you a really cheap license, or we'll do a profit participation if you guys put in the time and money to develop the game. What's that relationship like?
Good question. And the first ones I mentioned, they couldn't have been Nintendo publishers. They were just people. So as I said, like, there was this period where it was jumping on the bandwagon, literally, where, I mean, because people were coming from all places around the world, from all sorts of corporations. It just, something suddenly happened, and it was started by Nintendo inadvertently, or maybe on purpose, I don't know. But something suddenly happened in those days where licensing suddenly, and everybody thought they could make money. Suddenly people realized gaming, like up until that point, like you could ask me, you could ask anybody who was working in games, everybody was saying, it's not going to last. Why are you doing games? It's not going to last. It was that point when Nintendo came out, when the NES started selling big numbers, and suddenly everybody stopped saying, oh, it's not going to work, to, hey, how do we get in on this action? I mean, that was basically, so in the early days it was like that. I don't know what the potential business arrangements would have been. It was probably them thinking, well, if they can get a game. Most of these people weren't willing to pay that much. But when the proper Nintendo publishers came around, whether they be Konami or Jalico or anybody you could name who was a proper Nintendo publisher, then they were talking about licensed stuff as well, or ports of PC stuff to Nintendo. There were some pretty wacky ones of those as well. Just a sort of taking a footnote or a side note, when you say not talking about numbers, well, one interesting number, it isn't a number, but when Beam first released the Hobbit, I think it was the combination of Spectrum and the Commodore 64, maybe not the first version, but there was a year when we put the book in with the game. We saw the book was part of the package. Unwin Hyman, who were the Tolkien estate publishers, said during that year, we moved more books than they did in the world.
I'll believe it. I mean, it sold like hotcakes.
Yeah. So, but getting back to the licensing and whatever, so it was certainly, I always associate it with Nintendo coming on to the scene, but not so much maybe them as somebody coming on and then delivering huge numbers in terms of machines and things. And the world suddenly took games seriously at that point.
Now, how did the financial side of games work for you guys? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but Beam never becomes an official NES publisher. You guys never publish your own games. You're still just a strict developer, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
There's lots of reasons for it, by the way. There's good reasons for that.
Okay, we're going to get into that. So as a developer, first off, you're being hired by the publishers to basically deliver a product. Is this more profitable than publishing your own games on home computers? I mean, is the difference that big? Is there that much left over? Is it more profitable?
I don't have the exact figures at the time. But I would say no. But I also bear in mind that the industry was changing. The consoles were, Nintendo started, and there are other the competition in those days. It ended up being, it wasn't like it is these days. This was even before Sega come on. So it was Nintendo versus Mattel versus maybe Coleco and versus a couple other people, and to a certain extent even Atari, who had higher end consoles after the 2600 up to the 16-bit one. And then obviously Sega came along, and it was Sega versus Nintendo, and then Sony came along, and so on and so on. But suddenly the publishing models were focused on the consoles, and PC games, like we always did. When you say we published, we published in Australia, we published in the UK, but we always let somebody else publish our games in the United States and anywhere else. Our Melbourne house may have published in mainstream Europe, or used other people at the time. I'm not sure how that worked to a certain extent. But what I'm trying to say, even though then the margins were starting to be squeezed on the publishing end, because publishing was suddenly becoming more expensive, there was a bigger market, but there were more competitors, the games were getting bigger, you needed bigger marketing campaigns, etc., etc. Now, you have to understand, though, that when you put Nintendo in, it's a different magnitude. It's not even a choice. If you want to publish one Nintendo game, you've got to give, at the start, you have to give Nintendo, I think, a line of 10 million US credit to do a manufacturing run of cartridges. At the bank, you have to they had to see that before they would eat, because Nintendo did the manufacturing runs. And cartridge manufacturing wasn't cheap, which is why you might have come across classic stories of when the game has a bug that's fatal, that can destroy a company. When you're talking about Nintendo's first runs, and it was always interesting, because the game industry, even a lot of the programs weren't used to the cartridge-based thing. Like, they didn't do the Atari stuff, so they were used to computers where you could change data. And you literally, this is just a side thing, because I found it quite funny at times, because it happened a couple of times with programmers in Austria, where you would do cartridge games, you were doing what we call EPROMs, which were reprogrammable ROMs.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have, and then obviously when the game goes out, it would be put onto a ROM that can't be rewritten. That can't, that's it, it's permanent. And there were a lot of programs in those days who thought they would use what was called self-modifying code, which is, the code changes itself. Mm. And then you get people, you talk to them, and like, it's not working, and the game's on a ROM. Well, it's not working because you can't change the damn code on a ROM. And it was always funny, but a couple of times it was super expensive for certain publishers when some smart programmer got too smart and they didn't realise. But but no, the Beam wouldn't have been in a position at any time to pay the money needed to become a Nintendo publisher anywhere in any territory. Like, didn't have such a thing as a Nintendo Australian publisher, which you think might be a smaller buy, but who's going to just publish in Australia and New Zealand, for argument's sake, when you could, that might be 10,000 units if you have a hit game, whereas obviously if you're in the United States, you're in the millions already, and Japan and elsewhere.
Well, Beam did do, what was it, Australian Rules Football as an NES title, correct? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, I don't know who published. I mean, I designed a little bit of that early on. I didn't do the final thing, I don't think, but I don't know who published that though. If it was NES, we did do a football game probably before I left, but
I think it might have been Mindscape that ended up publishing it.
Well, Mindscape weren't a Nintendo publisher. They published our PC stuff in America, like Rock and Wrestle and Fist, or some of it. I don't think they ever become a Nintendo publisher. The first Nintendo, when we were pretty close to Acclaim in the United States at the time, quite a big Nintendo US publisher. Did some good stuff with Data East and Konami and I can't remember some of the others, but
well, you guys were also involved with porting some of the CinemaWare titles. To the NES.
There's good stories in that.
Oh, pray tell.
CinemaWare. Yeah, that was obviously, for those who may not know, CinemaWare was a company in the States who sort of blossomed during the Amiga days, I believe. They did these sort of their first game was Defender of the Crown, which was sort of very visual, cinematic game with sort of based on knights and castles and things, and with mini games, I suppose, for want of a better term, to do some jousting or to do whatever. I can't remember exactly all of it, but that was one game we were actually commissioned to do. We did a couple, but CinemaWare came down. They sent quite a big team of people down there, Australia. We started off, and we were doing it for Konami, and we spoke to Konami, and who designed, because it was such a big data game, they got permission from Nintendo to use a proprietary system, which was 2 or 3 times bigger than the usual Nintendo cartridges in terms of size, memory space it could hold. So we did this game, and cut the long story short, I was sort of supervising it, I believe, and we took all their code and we converted that, and we took the art. That was all looking good, and we started playtesting the game, and we played it properly. And it took 20 minutes from start to finish. 20 minutes to play the whole game. we spoke. We called up Cinemaware, and I don't know whether they come down to Australia or whatever, but they seemed totally unfazed. And I think they did come down. And what their solution was, and I read this day, they said the only difference between this and the Amiga game is the load times. When you display a scene or a screen, can you hold it for a couple of minutes and so on? They actually put load times into a ROM-based console game, and turned what we knew was a 20-minute game into a 4 to 6 hour game. That's how it was released. It was amazing.
As someone who's played Defender of the Crown, not just on an Amiga, but also on a Commodore 64, yeah, those load times are definitely a part of the experience. Okay, that is a fascinating one. And I guess this also brings up a point about the very different nature of computer games at this time and console games. And was it difficult for you guys with a background in computer game design to move into the console space and to rethink what kind of experience you're going to be offering?
I think I'll say no, because it seemed pretty natural. It's a bigger step these days, ironically, if you're starting out and deciding whether you're going to put on PC or you're going to put on console. In some games, it's not an issue, but in some, it is a big step. It's because of the nature of the games, because some games were only really suited for the consoles, and you were starting there anyway. Somebody was getting you to, like, if you were like the Punisher, for argument's sake, which they wanted I don't know whether they wanted or I offered, but it was something like a Tato game. We end up with like Operation Wolf, one of those side-scrolling shoot things. You really wouldn't do that on a PC. We didn't have PCs on a Commodore or something in those days. It wasn't a natural fit. And obviously, certainly when light guns come out, we did similar games with light guns. Whereas for a console, it was more of a natural fit. But quite a few games, obviously, but the thing also, it's like you see on mobile phones today, or in the last few years, not so much today, but when they were what we call single mechanic games. Well, we started with single mechanic games, but even before us, the coin-op industry, the arcade game industry, was all about single mechanic games, whether it be Space Invaders or Pac-Man or whatever. And that's what the phone industry turned into for quite a time, and they thought they were inventing these things from scratch. And if you look at them, quite a few of them are just the same as the early coin-op games. But it was certainly like in those days when we started early on, side view platform games like Manic Miner or Miner 2049 from the States, or those sort of things. Jumpman was my personal favourite. It was that sort of thing. And then when the consoles come out, there was sort of games like that, but they were scrolling, like Mega Man and other sorts of things. Mario, obviously, the classic. So I suppose the difference was you didn't, in those days, you didn't scroll home computer platformers, but you had to scroll console platforms, just naturally. It was the way it evolved. So, but you knew that anyway. You sort of didn't analyse it, just the way it was. You just knew it, I suppose.
And since you just mentioned Jumpman, also one of my all-time favorites, how much time are you or the developers inside of Beam spending actually just playing the games that are on the market? How aware are you of what else is out there at any given moment?
Super aware, not so much doing it at work, although we could and we did, but quite often after work people would have big game sessions, certainly when Mario 2 come out, or Mario Brothers 2, whatever it was. You'd come back, like I can remember coming back in the office at 2 or 3 in the morning to do something, and there was the accounts team playing Mario on the office computers. But certainly everybody played their sort of games at home. I mean, everybody played games. It was really only when I founded jumping massively, but when I founded a studio in Oxford for Empire in about 2000 or whatever, or 1999 or something, that when I hired a team of 15 people or whatever there, that I noticed for the first time ever that there were people who were doing it as a 9-to-5 job and didn't didn't even worry about the context of whatever they were doing, say, a 3D character for. Their job was to do the character. They didn't care how it was going to be used. And they went home. They'll tell they never would play a game in their life. That was the first time I come across that the gaming industry had moved beyond, everybody being obsessed with games, just being a job for some people. But in those days, when we're talking about the Beam days, everybody who was part of it, like even, the financial people, anybody, everybody was obsessed with games. So they played everything.
So you're doing the console work. I do have to ask here, when you're getting these big licenses, how much control over the content of the games are the licensees actually exercising?
It's the small things. It's not the big things. Like they're not really impacting the game design too much. You're sort of fitting it into their universe or their whatever. But because everybody's coming, these people usually aren't game people. So they're coming at it from what they're protecting, what is the core of their license and what they're protecting. And so it might just be the color of their logo. You got to get our logo right. You've got to do something. What we would see as small things is what usually it is from our perspective. So it's very easy to meet a lot of those requirements. Sometimes they put blockers in which are abnormal because it's such a small thing, but it blocks everything. So if they're a game sort of related, like when we did Shadowrun, or at least I did design before I left Beam for FASA and Data East. That's obviously gaming or high-end game people along, so they were involved on that. They had, because that was on paper-based tabletop games, they had their rule sets, and as long as you didn't violate their rule sets in those particular cases. But in the use of the Hobbit, just using Tolkien's characters, but not and creatures and things, but not going beyond that because other people owned rights to things. It's usually you do have intellectual property issues and laws you've got to check on some things, but certainly when you talk from your point of view, the question is licenses usually come, and it's what they see as their license, is what they're interested in, and that you're treated in a way which is respectful to that. And beyond Beam, if we're talking about Beam, but going beyond that, like when we first got involved with my company in the UK and the sister company at the time over there, we had sort of Perfect Entertainment and Teeny Winnie Games was my partner's initial company before we merged everything together. She was working on stuff, trying to get sort of conversion work at those times, but people were coming with licenses and so some really, like she did we did, I mean, I wouldn't say she, when it was her company, I was sort of there as well. We did a Last Action Hero game for but it was very driven by Arnold Schwarzenegger, but his one thing is no violence in the game. Yet the whole film had been violent. And he was sort of, he was going through a phase of, games can't be violent. Games have got to, kids play games. Yet we're doing a thing on a game which on a film which had shooting and stuff. And I can see his point. It wasn't, Last Action Hero wasn't. It was violent, but it was in a weird way, in a weird filmy way, a cartoony way, almost violent. But then at the same time, we had Madonna's management company come to us. So this was exactly the time when she was releasing Erotica, the album, books, whatever she was doing on that. And they wanted to do a game, or in quotes, all about Madonna and what she was doing at the time. And Madonna wanted to go, crazy about whatever. And then suddenly Time Warner, who owns Madonna's, recording deals and everything, were on the phone saying, whatever this game has, it can't have anything that's sexual or in any way sexual in it. And up to that point, the whole idea presumably had been, so you have these weird things where people see games in a different light. Arnold Schwarzenegger saw it as, a game wasn't the equivalent of what he does in film. And Madonna's publisher, Time Warner, saw what she did in real life shouldn't be, moved into a game. So there's been lots of cases like that where, things go a bit strange.
I can imagine. So the transition now from literary or film licenses to what you just mentioned, the facile licenses, MechWarrior and Shadowrun. How difficult was it to try to take a pen and paper, a turn-based system, and you made two relatively real-time games out of them? And if I'm not mistaken, Shadowrun, was that your first RPG design?
This is an interesting phase, Monica. I don't actually know anything about MechWarrior, if you're saying we did that as well, because after I did the Shadowrun design, that's when I left Beam.
Okay.
Studio.
Oh, sorry.
But
yeah. Okay.
Shadowrun, it sort of has a notorious history. Because it was a very fractured game development process in Beam, because after I left, not directly related to me leaving or whatever, different factions had different roles and things, and it went through different hands. But it ended up being more or less the initial game design with dialogue and stuff added, I suppose, and other stuff added. But it turned out, I mean, I've been interviewed quite a bit about Shadowrun, so people do like it as a game, but as it did have even I wasn't aware until, because people started wanting to talk to me, and I keep saying, well, I'm not I designed the first draft, but beyond that, and I did all the talking with Faster and everything, but beyond that, I'm not the guy. But then when I tried to put him in touch with what I thought was the guy, it became a bit political after that, because there were different people with different opinions, and there was a lot of notorious stuff happening in Beam at that time, apparently. So, but in terms of the original question, it was great to work with a rule set, because somebody, it wasn't just a stupid rule set. A whole team of people had spent years creating this environment, this world with these rules, and they had thought through them out. Like you could, when I was over there in Chicago talking to Jordy Weissman, and who was the head of Faster at the time, and the others there, they could answer any hypothetical, because they'd thought through them, that can characters be powered up if they're playing sport? Well, they said no, that in the universe, people controlling sport, they still have to be human, stuff like that. You could ask them, but basically, as long as I've played within their rule set, I could go totally original, and which is what I did. But I didn't deviate beyond, asked a few questions to where they were, what they believed things were extrapolating to, and could then work with it. So it was great. We're treating it as I'm always happy if I can treat something as a recipe for a world, then I can put a new story into that world. And that's what I did, jumping forward a lot with Discworld, because the original discussions was always from from Terry's publisher in particular, Terry's agent, was, can we just give you one book and you do that? No, I just want the world. I want to do an original story in the world. We give you 2 books. No, just the world. And that's where it ended up. And we'll also how we got that license, we can go into it, like, because but in principle, it was that it's great to be able to do a game in a world that's created. And to be fair, the Shadowrun world was more rule-based than Discworld. Discworld's got crazy, things going in all directions, but it still had a rule. It still had its own organic rule set, so to speak. And from Terry's point of view, as long as the Elven Queen had dark hair and you treated the orangutan as an orangutan and not a monkey, he was pretty happy.
This goes back to what you were saying about the little things that are important to the licensor.
Well, but to be fair, he if we go getting on to Discworld, it'd be absolutely clear. Terry's credit in the first game, I think, was throwing stones from afar. The second game was adding fairy dust. But basically what he meant by, he let me do the story as long as I respected I did the story, I did the puzzles, and then I because I didn't have time, I wrote sort of some of the high-level dialogue, and then I used the dialogue and write the right dialogue, and then give that to Terry. He went through every line of dialogue. Like in the first game, it was 5,500 lines. In the second game, it was 7,500, 8,000. In the third game, it was 20,000. He went through and edited, not in major ways. Like he never changed the concept or what was going on or the context, but he would just add fairy dust, make sure everything was working as it would work in a Discworld book. And that took a lot of time and effort. So and any of his licensed idiosyncrasies or whatever were purely based on fan perception. Like he would publish his books and fans would get the total wrong end of the stick with some of the things that he was trying to say. But he went with it. Suddenly, the Kevins, as he called them, the English fans, the Kevins, if they suddenly thought that black was white, then in the next book black was white, and but as long as in the game we didn't violate that, he was happy. He sort of wasn't married to anything he could be put on paper as being sacrosanct to himself, but he had a huge respect, and I think it was a genuine respect. It wasn't just a financial respect, but it was a genuine respect for his fan base, and that people were actually out there reading his books and taking them, enjoying them. So he was very loyal to that.
Now, I guess we do have to talk about Discworld, the Discworld trilogy you made. I loved them back in the day. Now, you do leave Beam Software. What is the situation at Beam that leads to that change, and what are your goals when you leave Beam?
I think the relationship was getting stale from both my side and Beam's side, to be honest. But we weren't getting any. We sort of mired down in this Nintendo licensing stuff, and we weren't. It was getting hard to get. Like we could do stuff like I bet before I left. I said we did Shadowrun, which was an attempt to do a big original game based on somebody, somebody coming to us, and it was Data East who come initially and said, we can put you in touch with Shadowrun, blah blah, with Farsa, and so on and so on. So it was getting harder to do something original, and totally original, but we could get the original feel from some of these other things. But it was just it was becoming bigger in some areas, and the original Beam of a lot of the people had gone. It was a different sort of Beam. But I'd always wanted to do something original, something my own anyway. And so Angela, who was my partner at Perfect Entertainment, we'd appointed Angela a couple of years back as the head of our Beam studios in Melbourne House. Melbourne House sort of disappeared, I suppose, but become Beam England or whatever. And she was looking after that. So her and I left to form our own thing. She formed her own little studio for a while I was in Australia, and we were jointly working on Discworld stuff, which eventually we all merged to Perfect Entertainment in the UK in about 92 or something, or 91, 92, and then I think Discworld hit in 93, and we were there until 98 or 99, whatever. So that was the situation. It was to leave Beam and then to try and do, and I'd focused on Discworld because it was just early days, and Terry was the biggest thing in the UK. This was well before Harry Potter, obviously. So we were quite sort of, not naive, but we approached Terry with an open sort of mind or whatever. But the way I did things, I did a game design up front. I did a thing on paper, which Angela could then take to Terry's agent, which then got to him, and then we got a meeting from that. And we got a deal basically from that. Now, I didn't know at that point that practically every publisher in the UK had offered Terry a big check, and he'd always said no. I'm the only person who offered him a game design, which he said yes. And even that game design changed into a second game design, but it was different. But the point is, we put in the work to do the work up front and to show him how we respected the license and could do a game based on it. There obviously had been something out a long time before that, I think a Colour Magic thing or something, but I can't remember exactly what that was. But
Text Adventure, years before.
Probably, yeah. So anyway, we met up with Terry and his agent and went to their house and everything and did the deal and met some of the other people who did the figurines. Like he had a Discworld family of people in the UK around him in those counties who were sort of doing stage shows in theatres and companion books and figurines and all sorts of stuff. And so it worked out well from that viewpoint. And then I suppose what wouldn't be known is we then struck a deal with Sierra Online. You obviously know Sierra Online from the not the Final Fantasy, the
King's Quest.
King's Quest, and the police one, and the Leisure Suit Larry. So I went over to the Sierra Madres in the middle of winter, and Ken
Williams.
the owner, Ken Williams, picked me up at the airport. I remember that because we're in a snowstorm. I just landed in a small plane in the middle of this mountains, and Ken had come in from some other end. I didn't know him, and he said, "Well, I'll meet you at the airport." And he said, "Look," and it was snowing everywhere, and cars in chains. You couldn't see him. And he said, "Oh, Roberta's just bought herself a new Porsche. It's over there. Would you like to drive it to the thing?" "I'm not driving your wife's new Porsche in the middle of this snowstorm." I remember that. "I'll just get in the passenger seat. Roberta will be fine." And the irony is, later on, Roberta and I had a big argument about who did the first graphic adventure game. Was it The Hobbit or was it King's Quest 1? I don't know who won that argument. We'd need sort of... Because I don't know, maybe her argument, she didn't know much about The Hobbit, if anything, but I think if we said that the original Hobbit with the line drawings and the fills was considered a graphic adventure, which I would have thought it was, then we win. But
actually, then she would probably argue Mystery House, because that comes out, I think, 79.
Oh, okay. Well,
79 or 80, yeah. So that's considerably before The Hobbit, but it's an Apple II game. I mean, it doesn't really get out of the United States, and it also doesn't do the real time stuff. Yeah.
And obviously, before we did The Hobbit, I mean, the only reason I knew of Beam Software in those days was because they were the Australian publisher of the Scott Adams games, the text adventures, and also the Zork games. I'd bought
the Infocom games, yeah.
Yeah, the Infocom stuff and the Scott Adams text adventures I bought from Melbourne House. They had a shop not far from where I am now, actually. So anyway, I went over there to Sierra, and you get to the town. I'm trying to think of the town. I keep saying Sierra Madre. That's the mountain range.
Coarse Gold.
Yeah, Coarse Gold. So you get to this town, and you're in this town. Then you go to a restaurant the first night. Ken, it's a big restaurant. Like, there's a couple hundred people. Everybody's a Sierra employee. Everywhere that town, everybody's a Sierra Online employee. And this was when they built this big barn where they created Sierra World. It was their online. It was the first people started getting into sort of online worlds at that time. And they were pumping all their money into that. And that's a thing that we remember in this story. The Sierra Online, which was a huge multi-story barn with all computer people doing stuff in it and looked impressive. But literally that town, no matter where you walked or went in that town, everybody was part of Sierra. It was like they owned the town. But anyway, we did the deal with Ken to use the Sierra engine, and they would send, so gave us the code. They were going to send somebody over from the team over from California to London to work with us and to help us if need be, whatever we needed. It was a good deal, and so we started using that, and then that big barn, which was eating up, it turned out about $1 million a month, meant Sierra closed all external, suddenly announced a month or so later, all external projects, even half their internal ones, were being closed because their online world was eating everything. So, and I didn't really, even then, I met, it was only somewhere at a show a year or so back, I met some guy, some Californian guy, and he said, "Oh, Greg, you don't know me, but I was actually the guy that Sierra hired. They were going to send me to London. I was actually at the airport when they pulled me back. I was coming to London to work with you guys." So anyway, cut a long story short there, we started with Sierra. So I was getting familiar with their engine and how we're going to use that. And then that got stopped. So we had a game, we had a design, and we'd sort of started some stuff, but we'd have to start from scratch. So we decided to do our own engine, which was fine. I wanted to design an engine anyway for this sort of thing. But then we had to find a publisher because we needed money. So there was a trade magazine in the UK called CTW, I think, where we put an advert in, publisher wanted, for Discworld game. We got three phone calls that first day. I don't know who the third was. One was EA, who come in first, and one was Signosis. And somebody else come in as well. I can't remember who they were. But EA came in. They liked what they saw. All their people, yeah, this is great. We think we can do something with this. And then they went away. And no, then it must have been that day or the day later, Signosis come in. And they took the office range. So they said, we're not leaving the office until we do a deal. And they kept, offering reasonable terms. So we did a deal with Signosis. We weighed up everything. And basically, they probably didn't hand over a check on the first day, but it was that sort of deal. They were gung-ho. I mean, there was all guns blazing. They wanted it, blah, 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 and they were going to help do all they could to support it. And cut that story a little bit short. Literally 3 months later, we get a call from the EA guys saying, okay, we finally put this through our processes and we're happy to do a deal. We'd forgotten about it. 3 months. And
oh my
but anyway, so said sorry, but
No, that's perfect. And now I do have a couple of questions. I didn't want to interrupt it because the story was great. And it's actually an interesting perspective because I've interviewed Ken Williams and the whole Sierra Network barn thing came up. So hearing your perspective of what Coarse Gold looked like fits in nicely with that. First off, you did the design document for Discworld for the first game. Was your idea always to be a point-and-click adventure game, or were there any other game formats that you considered?
I always saw it as a point-and-click adventure game. It was a bit more the first version that got the deal with Terry, and even he mentioned it later on. It had a couple of other things in it, which I'm going to have to think how to explain it. It was always puzzle-based, but it had a bit more build your character stuff up, I suppose, or what's the term in some of the paper, but in some of the paper
RPG elements.
Sorry?
RPG elements like stats?
Yeah, sort of, but more like in feats and things. Feats, I suppose, is a term I'm looking for, where characters Rincewind or somebody might have certain feats. But I removed all that and made it a purely point-and-click adventure. And Terry did ask about that. And one of the other things I had in there, because I'd always liked the idea of game bloopers and things. I was actually trying to design in Blaine Goobers sort of funny outtakes. But you can't really, it turns out you can't really design those things in. You've got to find funny things that happen when you're doing the game. That's when you're doing a game correctly. Funny things don't tend to happen so much as when you're doing a total disaster. So I had made a big point about sort of like that. In those days, quite a few feature films would have blooper reels at the end of them. And I had made a big point about that, that Rincewind would have a stunt double or a stunt dummy and other things. But it sounded good on paper, but when anything I tried just sounded, it was executed too wooden. It always felt contrived. And always, as I said, the best bloopers are the ones that just come out of nowhere. So the first version had a few other things in it. It had a slight RPG feel to the characters, but not so much that you could build the character up, but the character had different quirks or feats that you could, powers, for a better term, but not quite powers, but things they could do. But it quickly sort of condensed down to a classic point and click, because I really enjoyed it, and I did quite quickly the story and the puzzles. I enjoyed using comedy because comedy is the best way to do puzzles because you can do stupid situations and like I was sick of even point and clicks in those days. It was find the key to to open a door, and it was always obvious stuff like that. And I did put in Discworld 1 a key. You need a key, and there's the key sitting there. When you go and get it, a parrot takes it, and the key goes through so many things that it ends all falling off the world onto the back of the turtle. So you've got to go through the whole game to get the key, which I can't remember what the key did. But it was a key, but it was just to take the Mickey out of that whole thing, doors and keys and whatever. So no, it's soon condensed into a point-and-click adventure puzzle game. And the beauty of that is, as I kept telling people, because I had a script and I had every puzzle, and you could build to that, and you knew what it was going to be at the end. They could test it quite clearly, even though the first game, for pressure reasons, did go out with lots of bugs for a period of time, not for long because we did a patch, but that was more just Signosis rushing it out. But you could actually see what the game would be from paper. This is one game you could play through on paper and get that because of the nature of the game.
Gotcha. Now, from a budgeting standpoint, I can imagine that a level of preparedness, knowing exactly which art resources you're going to need and so forth, did that make that job easier? Were there any big surprises? Because as far as I can see in your resume, you don't have any graphic adventures before this that you had designed.
Apart from the Hobbit.
Yeah.
But I redesigned parts of the Hobbit. But yes and no, but this was more, mate, going back to the start of our conversation about the film stuff. This was closer to a film production. It was far easier. Discworld 2 was a film production, but Discworld 1 was sort of an indie film production equivalent where, we would get in, we'd hire on contract a team of animators who'd work for Disney and other places, but they were, those days they're floating around. They come in and do work. We do have layout artists, colour people, and we also hired, a close friend of mine who became a close friend of mine, Nick Martinelli, brought him on early. He was a storyboard and concept artist and worked on quite a few TV series and the odd film and things. And he loved the idea. He jumped at the chance to sort of be the concept artist to convert the Discworld to a real art style. And obviously the first game was pixel art. It was done while we had sketch, where everything was drawn out properly like you would do for an animation production on paper. It was converted, it was just done as pixels, whereas the Discworld 2, we used similar people, the same people most of the time, Nick and his crew, to do the concept and the colour and the paper and the layouts and the key frames. But we then went to Hanna-Barbera in the Philippines, where they had 900 animators and they could work on, as well as the Flintstones and the Jetsons, they could work on Discworld too. So that was professionally done by a two-dimensional animation studio, or animation studio did 2D art. So yeah, it was a natural evolution, and that worked out reasonably well.
Now, when Psygnosis comes on board as the publisher, and you said that you were thinking of, first you were going to use the Sierra engine, then you were going to develop an engine of your own. Psygnosis did have one point-and-click adventure game in their repertoire, Innocent Until Caught. Was there any talk about trying to use that existing resource, or was it always going to be an original one at that point?
It was always going to be original. They didn't certainly mention that. I was aware of it, I believe. But I mean, I wasn't never considered using it. I wasn't interested in. We'd already made the hard decisions. Not that I don't think there could have been much they could have brought to the table other than support, which they did. We'd already made the hard decisions and designed the engine and how we're going to create our own scripting language and so on and so on. And I had seen quite a bit of the Sierra system and their system, because it was so old and being changed so much. They were losing track of it, to be honest. It wasn't going to be the super easy job. That's why we were getting a programmer sent over on the Sierra system, because it had sort of become quite big and convoluted for what it was doing because of the time they spent doing these games. They'd done had a long history of games, point-and-click adventure games at that point, and evolutions of their engine. So we didn't see it as a negative. It put us behind, but it gave us a chance to sort of do it, possibly a little bit more, maybe. It's hard to say. Because obviously at the end of the day, you could see how you could have done Discworld in the King's Quest style. So, 6 of one, half dozen the other, I suppose.
Yeah. Now, when Psygnosis comes on board, if I understand the timeline correct, they're already owned by Sony at that point.
No.
They're not owned by Sony. Yeah.
No, you've hit the most controversial part of this discussion. I don't know what.
Yeah.
You've hit the worst part of everything. No, we did Discworld 1, then we did Discworld 2. And during that process, we become quite close to Psygnosis, and Psygnosis were giving us all their porting work from, because their other their studios they were closely affiliated with, like we're doing games like Wipeout, Destruction Derby, and a couple of others, and we were porting those because they were doing PlayStation originals, we were porting them to Sega or the PC or whatever in different cases.
Oh, okay. So you guys, sorry, just so I understand this. So while you guys are developing your own original game, Discworld, you're also doing porting work for Psygnosis other games.
Yes, that's how the company. That's how Perfect Entertainment was. That's how we operated, was to support the original game by making sure we had titles which were bringing in money all the time, which was supporting stuff, and we were always doing that. And when we started doing Discworld became the original. Like, there were a few small things done before that, or attempted to do before that, but when Discworld started, it was big, so it became the original part of the company doing that while we were doing ports. And we've been doing ports for various people in the UK and Japan, but because we had the relationship with Psygnosis, they started, when a slot became free, they would fill that slot up. A porting slot became free, so we ended up, 95% of our ports were suddenly with Psygnosis while we were doing Discworld for Psygnosis. So Discworld 1 went out, Discworld 2 went out, and Psygnosis, or at about that time, Psygnosis come to us and said they were planning to go public and float on the stock market, and would we become part of that so they could expand out and we could float as well. And so we attached with them, and they were expanding middle management because their financial people had said the best way to do an IPO is to expand middle management. You wouldn't believe it. Like Discworld 1 had one producer from Psygnosis, Discworld 2 had 4 from Psygnosis, and they suddenly opened a big studio in Shepherd's Bush, I think it was, in London, which had a lot of people. So they were gearing up for a massive float. And they said, as part of that, they gave us a huge financial sort of contract for all their ports to Sega. So they said, you can have Destruction Derby 2, we'll wipe all these games. Well, bread and butter ports, port to Sega, can you expand your team accordingly from 30 people to 50 people? Which we did. And we would go through all the process, and it was literally a week or two from floating, and we were expecting to float for our part of it was about, in pound sterling, was about 22 million pounds, I think, at the time we were going to float for. And then suddenly Psygnosis went quiet, and then when we pressed them, they said, "Oh, the float's off. We were just bought by Sony for 200 million pounds. You're not part of the deal." And that was a bit of a shock, obviously, but then the killer was Sony got in contact with us and said, "We understand that you're porting all Psygnosis games from PlayStation to Sega. We're Sony. We don't allow any of our software on Sega. We're tearing up the contract. Sue us if you like." So we did.
Oh.
And then we met them in court. We met them at Sony Soho Square, which is the head of Sony in UK, which was an interesting day because we were waiting there. We had a lawyer. We actually employed a lawyer internally, and then they said, "Come up." And we went upstairs to one of their meeting rooms, and 9 lawyers in dark blue suits filed into this room like a conga chain. It was really, I thought it was funny, and they obviously were trying to intimidate. It was quite funny, I thought, but then they said, because it was a famous day in the UK, we didn't know at the time, but they said, "We've had a good day. We've just screwed George Michael. Now, what do you guys want?" That was the day that, it was all in the news. Sony had sort of cancelled George Michael or something, contract, and come out on top. And then So in the end, we, after a long period where we were just, the company was just surviving on the smell of an oily rag, basically, and I was paying stuff on my credit card and everything. We did a settlement where they paid us a token amount, really. It was, which paid off some of the bills. So we went from that point to that other point, from high to low via that. And Discworld 3 came out in the interim. But our problem is because we've got so close to Psygnosis that, if we, obviously, and it's correctly from their position, if we sued Sony at the time, they obviously have the right not to, not to freeze everything. But because all our income was coming from the ports as well, we sort of in a bad spot. So we survived for a year or two like that, but it wasn't really going to last.
Oh, my goodness. I'm so sorry. I mean, the moment you said that you were going to be porting Destruction Derby 2 to the Saturn, and I know that didn't come out, I was like, oh, I see where this is going. Now, I do have to ask, because point-and-click adventure games have traditionally been known as very graphics and sound resource-intensive titles. There have been some limited ports, King's Quest V to the NES, Monkey Island to the Sega CD, but typically they've been difficult things to do. Did the porting of Discworld to the Saturn and the PlayStation, did that in any way influence designs for the game engine or how you were designing the resources of the game?
To be honest, we started as PC based, and to a big extent, I'm trying to remember because I wasn't involved with the ports to any great extent, and I don't think we did them internally. We might either we outsourced or Psygnosis outsourced a lot of that stuff. It was treated as a proper port as opposed to, when you do an internal port, you do what we did with Hobbit. We got the data and we just port the engine and then we put the data over. But I think these were outsourced in a way where they might have been treated. They mightn't have been done that sort of way. To be honest, I'm not over all of it. I can't remember.
Okay.
I do remember the testing the PlayStation. I know the PlayStation one we had work being done in house, but I'm not sure the process. I do remember that. I mainly remember because of the testing requirements. Because this was PlayStation 1. Sony, this was before everything went to pot with Sony, but they were saying how you had to test, like you had to have 2 rooms for PlayStation. You had to have one where you have all the machines in at room temperature. Then you had to have an air-conditioned one where they were cooled. And the cooled one was your control one because they always worked in a cool environment. But you had to make sure they always worked in a room temperature environment as well. So the PlayStation 1 was the first machine we'd ever use where you had to have climate control to do testing. It was interesting.
Oh, wow. Now, so Discworld Noir comes out, and that's shortly thereafter. As far that's when Perfect shutters, correct?
Yeah. Discworld Noir was bought straight away by GT, which GT Interactive was Good Times Interactive, who were then eventually bought by Infogrames, or they were bought by Infogrames during that process. I think well before the game came out. And obviously, it was a bit different to the others, being sort of three-dimensional, but it's pseudo three-dimensional, 3D character with sort of fixed 3D environments.
Now, did that also mark the end of the Discworld license, or did that was it a 3-game deal? How was that license constructed in that sense?
It wasn't necessarily a 3-deal thing, but obviously with Perfect closing down, it became a 3-game deal. And this has been because there's been people chasing me for years for Discworld, and it's interesting where some things may happen with that in the future in terms of re-releases, remasters, whatever. I'm not sure, but the licenses then they've had a convoluted issue, but they did basically revert to Terry and the games, I didn't know until recently. I always assumed everything went back to Terry or Psygnosis or Sony owned theirs. I didn't, because I was never over. But I only found out this year that the license in the UK, when a company goes down, the intellectual property, if it's down for, once it's been down for 10 years, the intellectual property becomes property of the Crown, of then Queen Elizabeth, but now King Charles, and split with the original creative person who created it. So Discworld's, the IP is actually split between me and King Charles at the moment.
Okay. Well,
I didn't know that until it was explained to me by some lawyers this year, and because they're wanting to do deals and things, and doing a deal with me as far, well, technically, if they can do a deal with me, then it should be easy to do a deal with the Crown, because the Crown's not doing anything with it. They just want to, just the way it's a very archaic system in Britain, apparently.
Like so many things in Britain. Do you return to Australia then after that?
After Perfect got into all that trouble and was closing effectively, I think about 1999, I was heading back to Australia when I got a call from a couple of people, and one or two things didn't work out, but I got headhunted by a couple of people. But then Empire, which was a London-based publisher, small publisher, said they wanted to set a studio up in Oxford. They already had sort of people in and around Oxford working in houses and things, I think, and in nearby towns. So they said, look, just go up and have a look, see if you like Oxford. And so I took the train up to Oxford, had a look, and I thought this is okay. I like the university area. It's a nice town. It's more what people outside of Britain think Britain would be. Like most of Britain you initially see isn't like it isn't beautiful postcard sort of areas. Oxford's more like that. If you're in London or whatever, it's not. It's not like it's not like some of the nice. Like in Germany, you when you get to Bavaria or somewhere, suddenly you're seeing different stuff as well.
That's true.
I know wherever I landed first in Germany, it was extremely flat, incredibly clean on the side of the roads and stuff, but incredibly flat. But then you get to, it could have been out near, it was either Munich or Nuremberg, I think. But anyway, but ended up then going through Bavaria and something, castles and mountains.
Yeah.
All different. But it was like that in Britain, but not with the mountains and things. Obviously, their idea of mountains is something quite small. But anyway, Oxford was nice. So yeah, I thought, okay, well, we want to set a studio up in Oxford. So I set up a studio and called it Sick Puppies. Which had a couple of meetings, but anyway, it was set up a studio, about 15 people in a sort of industrial park just in the middle of Oxford, more or less, in a nice little area, and did based on the fact I showed him before, I set up a studio with the game I wanted to do was Ghostmaster, which was I don't know whether you know Ghostmaster, but it was sort of a Sims meets Ghosts, where you're controlling a team of ghosts. You're creating your own little team of ghosts and then trying to scare people out of buildings. And that we took a couple of years, whatever, to do that and get it out there with the Oxford team and whatever. And it's still it's got the biggest fan club of any game I've ever done, I think. And still people always contact me all around the world playing that one, but and doing. And asking questions I can never answer. People are always asking questions I can't answer from. I mean, fans. They ask questions, very detailed questions about things I just can't remember.
I do have to ask, because that game, I was looking it up on Moby Games, and one of the cover scans that they have, there's a sticker saying that there's a free copy of Ghostbusters, I believe, with the game. Was that a tie-in that you guys worked out?
No, tie-in. That may have been in America. Perhaps one of the chains of stores or distributors made their own tie-in. No, there wasn't any. There wasn't any. Ghostmasters was parody. Like this was a sort of a comical satire. It was a puzzle. It was a real-time action puzzle thing, but it was also a satire. All the scenarios were satires of films and things. Ghostmaster would have been parodied in one scenario. I think there was about 30 scenarios, but Yeah, but beyond that, no, there wasn't any tie-in or anything.
Gotcha. Now the game comes out. Is the reception just too muted to keep going as Sick Puppies, or what does the studio do after that?
No, we were working on a sequel, actually. It was more Empire overall was going through a bad patch as a publisher. They started to shrink, and then they were eventually bought after I'd left by a Korean publisher, I believe. But they were we were about the last studio because as I said, they had a few little studios around Oxford and places and other places. They basically, that was their business model, was sort of to outsource, but to their own little studios. And Sick Puppies was about as big as it got, possibly, and bigger might have been Razorworks in Kidlington, which is a suburb north of Oxford, more industrial area. They've been there for quite some time, and actually one of their senior guys I bumped into in just around the corner from here. He owns a studio in South Melbourne now. So they started closing down studios. It wasn't directly related to anything we were doing or had done. Or Ghostmaster, it was one of those games where, it was also in combination with how publishers publish things and what works with publishers. Different publishers could have done different things with something like this, but this was a game which created or had created by the fans, created their own fan base for this, and it's a huge one in lots of countries. And it's the only game of mine I've ever went on because they were the moderator of the UK group said, "Oh, come on one night because in those days they had chat rooms and all that sort of stuff." And it's the only game I've ever done that once, and I felt like I was sort of intruding in because I was just listening to what they were. These were when you typed in conversations, not so much when you speak them. So it was just people typing in. There were literally hundreds of people. But the conversations were really, they created their own universe and in this world. And they were talking, discussing the lives of characters in the game, doing stuff and things which I've never thought of or never, evolved or done. So on one hand, I'm very super pleased that I created a sandbox, more or less, which these people could happily participate and do things with. But I thought it was intruding to stay there anymore because they had their own, everybody, we all have our things we love, and there's no point. Sometimes it goes beyond whoever created them. And Ghostmaster is probably the game more than any of my games that have done that. It's went well beyond the original creation. And it's still, as I said, I still get I get more fan inquiries about than any other game, but even journalists or whatever. It's a game where people still ask a lot of questions. And it was interesting when it was on at E3, when we first showed Ghostmaster at E3. Everybody in EA T-shirts kept coming round and looking at it and filming it and taking notes and then going away and then coming around. This went on for a day and a half or something, and I was at the stand, and then Will Wright comes in eventually, the Sims guy. He said, "Look, do you mind if I use the way you're depicting and the way you're moving the screen as the basis for the next Sims game?" Yeah, he said, we've been trying to figure out how to do it, and you guys are the only people who've seen it done it correctly.
How so? Was it just the move the cursor to the edge?
It was just a simple PC thing. There's sort of a top-down isometric, but it was 3D. You could just using the mouse, you could rotate, and you could do. It was just natural. It worked really comfortably using a mouse. You could basically easily move around, zoom in, and do anything in this cutaway world. But in a 3D way, if you wanted to get in close on a ghost or get in a character, you could just use the mouse wheel and go right down. It felt nice. So I spent quite a bit of effort getting the system, but it did feel nice. And so anyway, yeah. So that was all. That was just interesting. But it was where is it? It was a reasonable thing. It picked up a couple of awards for whatever they're worth those days or these days. But when we're not talking these days, you've got BAFTAs and things and all that sort of stuff people win. But in those days, it was more somebody spray paints a joystick gold and gives you that with a thing on it. I've had spray painted cassettes, discs, lots of things spray painted gold. That was the big way to give awards. Spray something gold.
It was a simpler time, a more innocent time. Well, okay, so after this, there's a fairly lengthy period of time, at least according to your profile, where you're just doing freelance work, right? Or
Depends what my profile is, but yeah, after, well, yeah, it gets a bit, yeah, I was doing some freelance, but after I basically, well, when we're deciding when we were deciding whether we're going to wrap up the Empire Sick Puppies thing or how are we going to do that, I got some calls from Australia saying that my stepfather only had a month or two to live, and I'd go down and so I decided I'll go back to Australia and look after him. But what was meant to be 3 months, because I became a full-time carer, lasted for 7 years. So
oh wow,
basically a full-time carer. So I did some, not much gaming stuff. I did the odd film script during that time, tried to sell the odd thing in Hollywood or whatever. But so I was a carer for 7 years, from 6 years, sorry, from 2004 to 2010. And so I was out of games, and that's sort of a long period to be out of an industry which is, moving super fast, and you're getting older you as a person are getting older by the day. So after I looked after him and took him on a big round Australia trip, which is not a small trip, it's like going around Europe basically, and stuff, he did die eventually, unfortunately. But so in 2010, so I then had to figure out what to do, and I just did some local. I was in the country because we were in a small country town. I just did some stuff for a newspaper, some special projects for Wallace, and then I had a mate from the Discworld, Nick, who said the art director, who was working in India, and he was giving my name around over there a bit, and I got a couple of calls from Indian studios, and just to put it in context, I applied to THQ they had an Australian office, and they were looking for a studio manager / creative director, and I put in an application to them, and I didn't hear from them, so I called them up, and I spoke to a young HR woman, and she said, we didn't get back to you, but we're only after people with experience. And I said, you did look at my CV. She said, oh, yeah, but we at THQ, we define experience by what you've done in the last 3 years. We don't care about anything else. So,
oh, wow.
Okay. So within 9 months, that whole studio closed down, by the way. THQ closed them down. But anyway, so that was I thought, well, yeah, that really sums it up. The game industry, I'm sort of a bit screwed here, either which way, however I look. So, but anyway, I did a couple of interviews with Indian studios who contacted me, and Indian ones who are owned by American interests. They were sort of companies I didn't want to work with because they were doing more social, mobile, free-to-play, big money games, like 50 million a month games and that sort of stuff, US, but not the sort of stuff. I'm more the classic game person. I'm certainly not free-to-play, although I know how it works inside out. But anyway, I took one interview which was with Singer, actually, which was the original company that did these sort of games like Farmville and all that. And I didn't know I was being interviewed by them. I thought it was somebody else because I was so confused, because so many people were contacting me from India and places, and I took an interview. And so not only didn't I realise I was being interviewed by Singer, which was fine, but it turned out, and I didn't know because the woman didn't say that it was interviewing me. And at the end of it, she said, "Oh, Nancy, you're really good, but would you mind doing an art test for us?" Creative director, why do I need to do an art test? But anyway, so I said, no, look, I said, I don't draw, and there's no point in me doing an art test. I'll fail straight away. So she said, okay then. Anyway, they cut that short because I thought that, and then they went away. But a couple of months later, they contacted me and said, you've got the role of art director. I'd actually interviewed for an art director without knowing it. I did wonder at the time why so many of her questions were based on art and not on creative design. But anyway, so there's been a massive communication error there between us both. But anyway, but before that happened, I got interviewed by a company called Druva, who at the time were India's biggest and biggest game studio by a country mile. And that they liked what they first saw. So they said, "Do you mind doing a interview, a Skype interview or whatever with the whole?" Not the whole company, because the whole company was big. It was actually a 400-person studio. Because they did art for a lot of the major games, like we're talking over 10 of the top 20 games in the United States, AAA ones, they were doing art for, but they also got their game division. I can't say who because they had contracts, not to mention who they were working for. But so I contacted, I signed this call, and the whole studio, people everywhere asked them questions and talked about IPL cricket and other things. And then the question came up, which is sort of what you asked, Greg, what the woman at THQ, what have you been doing in the last few years? And I thought, here we go. I'll just say the truth, and then I'll get this over with. I said I was looking after my stepfather, couldn't work, so I looked after him for the last 5 or 6 years. And there was silence in the room. Yeah, that's. And then the CEO of Druva said, "You've got the job." We didn't know people in the West had an Indian attitude to looking after family. We've never come across this. Sorry, I'm contrasting this with the wrong. I'm contrasting it with THQ. I should have been contrasting it with an interview I took with a Chinese publisher, because the same question, before I did the Druva interview, I did an interview with a big developer in Chiang Mai, a big city in China. And we went through, and when they got to that question, and I said that answer, that just fell dead. They had no interest after that. When they were only interested in work. But the Indians went the total other way. They forgot all about any work qualification. At the moment you said you spent 6 years looking after your family, they just loved you. Come on, you come over as soon as you can. You got the job. So I went over there for 3 year and 3 year contract. It was great.
And and this is interesting because this is a very different type of section of the industry and a very modern one. I mean, when we started off talking, you mentioned you were the one who first proposed we need an artist here, that separation. And now here you're working for a company whose primary development, if I understand it correctly, is to just provide things like art assets and additional
in India.
Yeah, in India. Is that what you were doing now, or was it game design?
No, I was hired to expand the tiny game, the game creation division, and do original games, and which turned out doing commission from Europeans or American publishers, whatever. So it wasn't. It really we tried to do. It was hard to get the original thing up. They were always open to the idea, but it sort of. India was an evolving sort of market industry. Games weren't a natural thing over there, and Nintendo came in quite late. So when you can get very confused over there when you start talking to somebody and they might be, 22 years old, and they say, "Oh, we grew up with Nintendo," and it was because Nintendo came in like 20 years after they did it everywhere else. But there isn't a game culture, and it comes across with they got great engineering, computer engineering degrees and institutes and whatever. But it's really hard. You got these great programmers, and you just want to talk about the simplest game mechanics, like how to do Mario sort of control. And normally I just say, well, just make it like Mario, but you've got to actually it's like you've got to then break it down and say, well, I want you've got to do this and this and this, and then stop the momentum. And it's actually very hard even then, because when you're talking to people who are creating something, but it isn't what they're creating isn't part of their normal culture. It's really, really hard to do that. And the art was the same. They did they did a huge amount of art. As I said, they were eventually bought because of that. Like Rockstar owns them now. Rockstar have access to at least 800 or 900 artists in India for doing whatever they're working on, GTA, whatever the next version is. But even the artists, you're looking at some incredible artists doing 3D work, and in the studio because they had multiple studios, so the 3D one was nearby, but most of our guys, or most of the social art team were 2D, but the 3D will be the game studio, which I'd set up, had 3D artists, so we were a 3D thing. But what I was saying is, even though world-class artists, they don't know, because it's not Indian art they're doing. They could be doing, and they were doing, art for the best driving games, the best space games, and the best everything. But because it's not how the sort of art they would normally do, they had no idea they were doing a great job. And people, you say, "Wow, you're incredible! This is incredible." I was like, "Really?" Yeah, you know. So it was a bit. There was the cultural difference in that. It's not a, and also, as in the early days, I said before, Nintendo, people would say games are never going to last. They still say that in India. I mean, I hired 3 or 4 designers, or maybe more. No, probably with interns, probably 8 designers, because they actually have design institutes everywhere, and they have some good game colleges in deals with France in particular. There was a group that DSK, Super Infocom, which was half Indian, half French, funded by the French government. So they had some of these really big schools, colleges, where they were, trying to teach the best, how to do games. So they were getting students from all over Europe, in particular France, obviously, sending them to India, and then the Indians are also going there. But anyway, the point is, there's lots of people who want to do games in India. I mean, lots. I'm talking, I did tours with schools and giving talks and doing sort of sessions and judging game jams. I'll never forget Chennai, where we're judging a game jam as part with Unity and Intel and people, which are handing out all the skills, Unity-based Intel PCs and whatever, and IBM. Somebody was involved in the hardware side. But anyway, turn up to this auditorium, and somebody asked me, "Could you mind doing the talk, because we don't want to do the opening talk?" And I don't have to do it I can't talk in Hindi or we're in Chennai, so in Tamil. No, just talking English. I go out. And somebody, a young woman introduced and said, "I would like to thank all the 3,000 students who have attended today, and from all over Tamil Nadu." And literally, you've never seen, you go in and then you start looking at their school projects they've been doing, and you've got old teachers who have no idea about games. You've got these young kids who are just super into it and super using programming Unity and doing some good stuff. So it was incredible over there, to be honest. But anyway, the point is, there was that huge cultural difference. And what I was going to say on the designer side, one of my top designers had to constantly say he was a fashion designer, because his parents wouldn't have accepted him if he was a game designer. When I hired one young kid, his first job, I hired him as a game designer. He'd just done a course. His father called me up and said, "Would I please sack him so he could get a proper job?" A young female designer I hired was called back to her hometown. She's still in games. She's doing a great job, actually, but she was called back because the parents didn't want her working in the game industry. So somebody else there wasn't anybody who was blessed. And in India, that's a big thing. There was nobody who was blessed by their family to be working in the game studio. It was quite bizarre. And they all said, "It's not going to last." Because obviously India gets a lot of IT work. By IT work, I mean with big companies like IBM, Honeywell, and all those people have big, massive complexes, and they do very simple sort of programming. That's what they think is a proper job in that sort of industry. But anyway, it was enjoyable. For 3 years, it was a great time. Good people, good company.
And that then leads you to Harmonious Productions, right?
Sort of. I come back to Australia after the 3 years and sort of had to figure out what to do. So I don't know, I must have saw an ad in a thing that was, at the time, it just closed down last year, but just around the corner from me again, there was a place in Melbourne is the Australian, well, it was, and it still is, but the Australian game industry took a bit of a hit during the financial crisis, and other things. So it's not so much AAA stuff anymore. This Sledgehammer have Call of Duty stuff going on down here, and there's a couple of sort of biggish publishers doing studios doing ports and things, or maybe the odd original thing. But there's quite a bit. There was a big indie thing, and the indies. A lot of the indie studios were in this one building, which was funded by the Victorian government, by what they call Creative Victoria. It was a really funky building, and they had probably 30, studios from single person ones to ones with 30 people in it or whatever. Even Epic had one person in there as their Epic evangelist for Unreal 4 at the time. So I saw it wasn't with Harmonious. There was another young guy who formed the studio and was looking for a producer, he said, and he'd hired a great team of people from the mobile sector who'd done some great work. He had this huge team. His game just went out recently to critical acclaim, I think, but this was 3 years later or whatever. But anyway, I come down to talk to him, and he said, "Oh, look, it was quite sort of funny because I didn't mind. I come down. He said, look, it's sort of false pretenses. He took me out lunch. Said, look, I've already got the person I want to hire as a producer. She's a former bank manager. She's great with spreadsheets. I didn't want anybody creative. Creative guy didn't give us sort of wanted somebody who's totally just production." I said, fine. He said, but I did want you to come down and talk to us. I want to talk to you because you're part of the culture of the industry. So he basically. And ironically, a couple of people who accepted gave me interviews at the same thing. Oh, yeah, I don't want you to give you a job. I want to, talk to you. You've been around a long time, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, this guy said, look, I know I'm not going to be hiring, but I'm going to personally walk around the arcade. And I'm going to tell everybody, you're available, you're the best guy I know, blah, blah, blah. So about 3 people contacted me from him walking around and telling him, and one of them was Harmonious, and I went and I saw them, and it was a nice little group of sort of people who'd come out of college and stuck together and formed their little studio. And we're doing something you should never do. It's against the rules to do your college project as a game. You should never do that. But they did it, and they actually sold it. Now they're looking at their second and third game. So they weren't in a position to pay anything in terms of money to speak of, but it was just getting back into the field with young people doing creative stuff, and I could help guide and mentor or whatever where possible. So I took that job, and they were trying to do their thing, and it wasn't. It was everybody was starting to push back to only a couple of days a week because it was financially tight for them. And then I thought, well, I better. Because A, I wasn't getting paid much anyway, but B, when you're cutting it back, I couldn't even pay my rent. So I thought, okay, I better see what else. I'll do something. I'll look after you guys, but I'll try and get something else to do it. And so I saw an advert on a local website for somebody to look after a team doing VR, some unique VR stuff. I looked at their website, and they were doing a lot of funky stuff. But it was their main client who does. We'll get into a minute, Flame, who were doing some unique firefighter training stuff, and these guys were doing the VR coding for them. So I contacted them, and they said, "Yeah, okay, come for an interview." And they said, "Do you know? Well, where are you guys?" I said, "Oh, do you know South Melbourne? Yeah. Do you know the arcade building? Yeah, I'm in the arcade. No." And they said, "We're on the 3rd floor." I looked out. I said, "Is that you over there, Brad? Like 20 metres away, literally." So I got a job with another studio 20 metres from where I was. And but then I sort of become full-time with them after Harmonious sort of decided to close or to do their close. And then we were sort of taken over by Flame, the main client, Experiential Productions, as it was called. We had been doing sort of mainly VR and XR, AR stuff for advertising and marketing and just unique projects with hardware and software and all sorts. So there's some cutting edge stuff going on. But their major project was for a startup, Flame, which was a startup from one of the Australian universities, in Deakin University in Geelong, which is the next city down from Melbourne. So we basically decided to become part of Flame and form a software studio in South Melbourne. Flame funded forming of a software studio, which is which I was sort of the manager of the dev team. I am the manager of the dev team at the studio. But basically what we're doing is cutting-edge VR stuff with kinesthetic hardware. We've got, from on the firefighting side, I can't mention some of the more secret projects, but on the firefighting side, which is very out there, we've got a sort of a real firefighter hose connected to a winch, and it works. So you feel the pressure of the hose. You're wearing the self-contained breathing apparatus with the respirator and the mask and the oxygen tank, and you've got a heat vest on, but then you've got the VR helmet on, and you're in real scenarios with fire and smoke. You're squirting out water and or foam or whatever you're doing. And we're not just talking about it. When I first joined, it was sort of like display house. It was very plain. I've sort of been a big proponent of turning it into much more like the real thing, with lots of chaos and action and danger and stuff. So it's quite exciting and quite good, but it's cutting edge training technology.
That actually sounds fascinating. I mean, was it difficult for you to shift gears from the kind of, let's call it, level design that would be entertaining and challenging as a game, and move over to something that doesn't necessarily have to be challenging in the fun sense, but has to actually reflect a real world scenario?
No, it was more changing the existing systems they were using to be not more. When I say more gaming, occasionally we have to go gaming because current hardware in VR, you can't do everything in a real way. You try to, but you hit limitations, and it's how you do use the real-time technology, and that's a very gamey thing, to do real-time art and real-time stuff. So we have good programmers doing that sort of stuff, but from a more level design or more scenario design, which obviously there's got to be learning stuff has to be taken on board on all this, but by creating not so much a sandbox, but we're heading that way, but more creating a world where you can put scenarios in and then real things can happen. It's sort of treating how you would do some games. And certainly you can take game techniques and use in this. People who don't, and if not there's much competition, but people who aren't game-based, they end up with a lot blander stuff because even we, I mean, to be honest, purchase quite a bit of art assets and then change them a little bit, but you can't. It's not like game studio budgets where you can spend a couple $1 million doing art or whatever. It's not. You've got to purchase it from art stores online and tweak it and do whatever you can. So, but it's then using it in creative ways to make it look interesting and realistic, and having the tech art skills with programs with tech art skills to create smoke and fire and water and have walls falling down and your visor, getting full of water or grime or whatever. And if you spray water into something electrically, you're electrocuted, and things exploding if they get set on fire. It's all, even a big plane crash with, you're fighting fire and you manage to fight inside the plane. You get to the interior of the plane, you're fighting through it with people in your ear in the radio telling you, quick, hurry, people in need. And then the plane splits in two and you got to dive over and be the hero. And so you can do a lot of stuff.
Oh, wow. That does actually sound fascinating. Is there any plans on turning that into some kind of civilian experience? I mean,
well, in terms of spoon, obviously firefighter training is spoon, but that's but in terms of that's professional. That particular product, Flame Trainer, is our professional product for professional firefighters and industrial firefighters, the Air Force, the Navies. Like, we deal quite a bit with Air Forces and Navies, and we're doing some special projects for armies as well. Not offensive ones, but training ones. But in terms of non-professional, yes, we have a extinguisher version, which there is much more competition for that, where we are using a real extinguisher connected to VR, so we can train people how to use a fire extinguisher. And we have other things sort of as well, which we can't really talk about, but you're going out and about in the world soon. But so basically the flame sort of modus operandi is the kinesthetic. Something normally is kinesthetic, like the fire hose pulling back, or you feel a real extinguisher in your hands. and combining that with the virtual reality, as opposed to just using virtual reality with a controller. We provide hardware, the hose, the whatever, to be your controller.
Interesting. Absolutely fascinating. And I'm guessing this is a traditional VR with a helmet setup, correct?
Yeah. It obviously it's an evolving technology. What we're using at the moment is wireless VR, where everything with streams from we do have some stuff. We have some which are purely mobile, where it's just a headset and that's it, apart from you holding an extinguisher or something. But the big powerful ones use PCs, but they stream to the headset. So the headset's it's not cabled, so you're still not tethered to anything, but you're everything's streaming, which is the way VR is heading and AR and stuff.
And I do have to ask, is any of this also networked? So are the participants only interacting with AI or computer controlled firefighters and so forth, or can you network this up so that groups of firefighters would have to learn to coordinate with one another?
Yeah, no, you can tell you come from the game, and if you ask the right question, you won't believe how hard it has been to get multi-user accepted in the learning environment.
Really?
Yes, we have done we have got it. We have got teams, what we call teams, where at the moment there's 6 people can train together in the same scenario. They can be in different parts of the world because but they can. So you can have a firefighter team with primary and secondary firefighters, 2 crews. You can have an incident commander and stuff doing stuff. It's just, you talk to anybody in games or whatever, and they have a natural understanding of how multi-use is a big benefit. It's an exponential factor and the way people want to do things. It's just so hard. You wouldn't believe some of the debates you have in the other sector. The dev team can get quite frustrated with that, but we did put in the big effort, and so we have got a world-class multi. It uses real, because the firefighter avatars look realistic, and we're moving them as best we can. We can't track everything, so we've got a few tracking points. So, but it looks pretty good actually. I mean, that was the idea, because obviously the end users aren't. Well, the professional firefighters quite often are hardcore gamers, to be honest. But if you assume they're not gamers, it's very disconcerting when they get other software which might be a bit of multi-use and they're just basically a sphere or a pyramid or something moving around. Here they got when they see their mate, they're a real firefighter with their name above their head or whatever, and carrying a real hose and etc. Looking real. So yeah, it's good. It is working well in multi-user.
Fascinating. This pretty much, brings us up to today. Are there any other projects that you're working on outside of Flame at this point?
Not specifically. I just drop a hint that maybe Discworld might make a comeback one day, but that's all I can say on that.
Excellent. If there is any news, let me know. I would love to dive back into that world. Now, I conclude all of my interviews with the same question, and that is, looking back at your career, what is one development in the industry that became huge that you did not see coming? And what is one development that you thought was going to be huge that ended up petering out and going nowhere?
It's harder than you might think to answer those questions, because I'm so organically connected to when I've been in the industry. It's when you go out of it. It's hard to answer that in terms of software or hardware, because you start and you just always assume. I'm the sort of person who always, when people say it's not going to last or whatever, or when people now say, well, what can improve? It's realistic. No, it's not realistic. It's going to get better and better. It's always increasing. Technology will keep improving. Software will keep trailing behind, obviously. And never more noticeable than in the current space. I mean, VR, where the hardware does need to keep improving for obvious reasons. like obviously, like I'm tempted to just say the brutally honest, like what you didn't see coming was sort of everything being 3D, but then I did see sort of vector games in the coin ops in the early days and thought, this is going to be the future. But, obviously from when I started to now, even if you're doing stuff in 2D, you probably should be doing it in 3D made to look 2D as opposed to just doing it, everything can be done in 3D more or less. And that's just going to keep going until, I suppose the other thing that's just new now is, and it's going to be omnipresent, and we're doing it all with the AI, obviously, is now, a game, we can almost go back a few generations now. It'll be soon where a really good game program stroke designer or somebody can work with an AI to create a reasonable game. That's not too far off. Supervising it, and they won't be able to do it by themselves for a while. But that will be. But I'm more excited about using the AI in games itself, just to do better NPCs and things. To be honest, as opposed to actually creating any content. So it's really hard to answer that question of what didn't see. I mean, I'm going to have to almost default to just 3D, but then I didn't see it coming. And what was the other one? Was it the flip side of it? What I thought would be big and wasn't. Yeah, see, it's really weird, man, because the reason I started playing games and the reason I still play games and the reason I don't play multi-user games is because I play games to escape and just be by myself. So I could probably say I didn't see, multi-user coming to the big extent that it was. That's probably a fairer thing to say than what I said before, because my focus is always, and even now, like I don't play online games. If I play Dark Souls, I make sure I turn off. I don't want other people in the game. For me, games have always been about escaping to my own world, creating my own world, if need be, exploring my own world. That's not a shared experience. And what definitely is new these days, and look, I know a lot of kids, obviously, and I don't know a kid these days. Like, well, if you go to the psychological makeups of kids back when I was in, people who played games, most people were explorers and achievers and things, and social players were very small. I don't know any kid these days who could play a game by themselves. It's a social thing. That's far removed from when I started. So that's probably a better answer to the first thing. Social gaming across the board. I'm talking in AAA here, but that's obviously more. It's in every form. Social gaming is huge, which is good. It's good. I don't do it. I certainly see it as a good thing for everybody else. But as to what I thought was going to be big and what wasn't, apart from my bank account, I don't know. It's weird because the game industries went in the direction I would have thought it went. That's the problem I'm having. It's not like, it's like when I do a project that tends to go in the direction I think it's going to go, because when you plan it and that happens, it's not like your life story, which goes in different directions. So I don't know. I honestly can't think of anything that's major, that's earth-shatteringly big, that is not went well, and I thought would go incredibly well. I'm sure there is something, but I can't think of it at the moment.
No problem. Well, Greg, is there anything I didn't ask you about that I should have asked you about?
Depends if we can use the F word on this.
Oh, hell yeah.
Probably the funniest story and the one that's come back the most, and occasionally, and I think I was even in the Guinness. I might be. I shouldn't say I'm in the Guinness, but I don't know. Somebody said I was, but I'm probably not. As having the first game where the word "fuck" was spoken in it, and that was Discworld 1. And it was a funny story because it's even funnier with what happened. When I went to Los Angeles to record Eric Idle's Rincewind, we spent an 8-hour day in the studio, or 10-hour day. I think it was. In the end, it just kept going, and we just did it all. funny thing, he used to stand on his head to relax in the studio, like in between takes. If I'd stop talking, he'd go and sit down in the corner in his head and relax, which was quite strange. But anyway, after we found his voice, because I wanted his Monty Python voice, which his Cockney voice, cheeky Cockney, which ironically is not his normal accent, and he put it on for Monty Python. It was so long after he couldn't remember it. But anyway, at the end of the whole thing, after we'd done this, I said, Eric, can you do me a favour? And this was started because just before we did this, there'd been one of the members of the Pythons, Graham Chapman, had died. His funeral had been in London. I don't know whether it was John Cleese or somebody, which other Python, I think it might be John Cleese, who said at the funeral, he went up to give a speech, said, I want to be the first person to say fuck at this funeral. No, that stuck in my mind. And when I speak to Eric, the irony, there's a double irony in that, because we did, and even though I told Eric, and being super honest, look, Eric, I did contact John Cleese before you for this role. And we actually spoke to him and he said, fuck off, I don't do games. Then he did games a few years later, but it was funny.
Yeah.
And anyway, so we get to Eric at the end. I said, Eric, could you do me a favour, and could you say, I want to be in Rincewind's voice, I want to be the first person in games to say fuck, or in a game to say fuck. And so we had this the studio in Santa Monica had a young female intern who was just starting a job. And by what happened there, she got super embarrassed. Angela was my business partner. She was on the floor rolling in laughter because Eric went ballistic. He said, I want to beat fucking Arnie Schwarzenegger and be the first fucking person to say fucking the game, and I'm going to do it. And he just went on for 5 minutes. And anyway, we'll get back to England, and I take all the samples and get it done, and I put that sample and just put it away. And I tend to use it, but never use it. Yeah, because Eric had got carried away beyond what I thought. So anyway, there was 5,400 samples, give or take, and it goes out there. And then the game gets released, and I'm not worrying about it. And then I'm working back in the office in London about 8 o'clock one night, and somebody downstairs put through a call and said, Greg, you mind speaking to some woman who's called up? She's just bought Discworld for her son. And yeah, sure, fine. So, and so this young woman comes on the line, and she said, I said, hi, how are you? I'm the person who created Discworld. And she said, Greg, would you mind? I'm going to put I bought this game for my son earlier today, and it crashed at this point, and I'm going to put the phone to the computer. As you put the phone to the computer, it was Eric Idle in a loop saying, I want to be the first person in a game to say fuck. and I listened to it and I think, what? I'll get Signosis to give her free copies of everything. She's obviously going to be pretty mad, her little boy. And then I start to say that. She said, no, don't get me wrong. She said, I just wanted to call you and say that's the fucking funniest thing I've ever heard in my life.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So, one of the programmers then put it into subsequent versions, and if you tweak the Amazon or something, or if you touch it on the chest piece or something, Rincewind. There's some point where Rincewind says that anyway now, and there's also, he says it in Discworld 2 properly. It's actually in Discworld 2. But I did see there was debate online at one point. People were having a serious debate about that. I saw somewhere, and they say, yeah, we think Discworld was the first game to do it. So I'll take that.
Of the mainstream games, it may very well have been, say, a trailblazer.
I think it was in text. Somebody had done it in text, but I don't think recorded it before.
Yeah, no, I can't. Yeah, I can't think of a game that would have had it before that. One more question I got to ask. It just occurred to me. When you're doing the original design document for the Shadowrun game, was there any debate whether or not you would also do the Genesis version? Was there any reason specifically another studio did the Genesis version?
It was well beyond my time by then. When I was doing the design, it was for the SNES, wasn't it? The Super NES.
Yeah. Beam ended up doing that. A completely different studio did a completely different game, also with the same license, comes out almost at the same time. And that's why I was just wondering.
As I said, that game would have been delayed quite a bit. And I don't know what, maybe if it is also an official game, perhaps Data East decided to go somewhere else. I don't really know.
Okay.
Obviously, since then, there's been more Shadowrun games done, which are reasonable. I played them, and I did see they have done homage to the original in those games as well, just with the original character coming through and stuff. But I don't know anything about that. So I'd left after I did the design. I got the deal. I at least didn't get the deal, but I helped cement the deal with Data East and FASA, and went over to see him and worked it all out, the design. But beyond that.
No. I was just wondering if you knew what the story was with that.
And the only other thing worth mentioning, unrelated, because the only other thing I'm sort of get asked about, very rarely, but by people who've done their homework, but those people who asked about games that never made it, they might know that we started Naked Gun.
Whoa! Okay.
I really loved. That was after Discworld. I wanted to do something comedy, but so went over. Even paid Leslie Nielsen a lot of money to do. He was going to do the voice acting, obviously, for the lead, and we even did a animated. If you've seen any of the Naked Gun or the Police Squad TV series before it, they had the police siren going through things and films and things. We did this animated thing where the police siren went through famous games from Doom to Mario and doing all those things, getting ready for Naked Gun. I really liked I don't know. I mean, it was. Out of all the things I've worked on, I was the most proud of the design, the puzzle design. There's some really crazy puzzles. But anyways, you might know the history of that. We went over to Los Angeles, got the deal with Paramount and Leslie Nielsen, and then something tragic happened in that O.J. Simpson, one of the stars of the thing, killed his wife.
You're right. That would have been right around. Oh.
Yeah. I was actually underway almost. We decided to try and hire Priscilla Presley to be the female. Obviously, she was the girlfriend in the show to Leslie Nielsen, and going over to do that, and then it all just went downhill once obviously that broke.
Oh, that is so. Sorry. As a fan of the movies, I can totally see that having worked, but the OJ thing would have just killed that in its tracks, unfortunately.
Yeah, but that's one of the classics that's probably the only big thing that never made it to completion. Because people often ask, did you do things we've never made it? But not really. But that was one thing that was started, and I was really looking forward to that one.
Oh, yeah, no, join the crowd. Do you still have the design document?
Somewhere I could probably lay my hands on. I probably could remember the best parts of it, but it was all, because it was all contemporaneous, it was based on parodies of films at the time, like Terminator 2 and The Fugitive and whatever. So there was a lot of stuff, and Lethal Weapon, like Discworld had Lethal Weapon 2, I think. But I used to satire things like Discworld did a lot, but this was really doing stuff. So it would have been based in an era, so it wouldn't be quite as relevant. I'd have to change things today, put it that way.
Of course. But still, as a historical document, it would be an interesting thing to see. I mean,
yeah, probably. I might dig it out and try and find it. I don't know where it would be, but
yeah. I mean, if you have it, I contribute to a website called Games That Weren't, gamesthatweren't.com, and that would be one of those things, a great story to add to that compendium of the games that never quite made it out of the gate.
Yeah, for various reasons.
Yeah, cold-blooded knife murder of two people. That's probably the first time that's going to show up as the reason why the game didn't make it, So sad. For many reasons. I mean, Leslie Nielsen, I don't know if he ever did the voice for a game.
I'm not aware of it.
No, that would have been a first. I mean, he's unfortunately passed now, but that would have been awesome.
Yeah. No, awesome. Yeah, it was. I even had I did it myself actually. I come from montages, but I had the cover art and the title. The title was, because this was in the days of was between when floppy disks were going from big, like 5 1/4 to 3 1/2, whatever. But I called it the Naked Gun 5 1/4, but /3 1/2. Forever hold your peace. and then there was a picture of Leslie Nielsen in a bridal veil, speaking out and holding a gun. So
oh, that's beautiful.
it was it was looking quite good. But anyway.
Oh, trust me, if you can get a copy of that document out there, I would just love to read it. I mean, that would be hilarious.
Yeah, I'll see if I can do it. I don't know where it'll be, but yeah. When I get back to where I store stuff.
Okay. Well, you've given me almost 3 hours of your time. Thank you so very much. This has been tremendously insightful.
Okay, yeah, and I hope it works out well and people gain something. A bit of nostalgia.
Any last words for any fans out there?
Well, for fans or people, more importantly, people who are these days. Obviously, there's many more people interested in games, and if you want to, if you do want to actually create games, that's great, and chase that as hard as you can. But just playing games, it's without getting too obsessed, but only 99% of the time, you always have something else. But no, it's not so much fans. It's just people who enjoy games, and that's all I was about. And if anybody enjoys something that I've created, that's great. That's better. But it's all about just whatever. I enjoy games. I enjoy other people's games, and I'm glad some people enjoyed mine.
Excellent, and that's really all games are supposed to be there for: enjoyment.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, Gregg, thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Much appreciated.
I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.